Before continuing with this program, allow me to preempt the more skeptical viewer's notion that the subject matter deals primarily with bygone days and dry ancient history. When we hear the words divination and goddess tradition in a title, our minds are not immediately stirred into thinking about the present fast-paced information age. However, though the origins of both divination and goddess worship do reach back to antiquity, it was in fact for our times that the high arts of divination were created. It was for our Kal age of iron and tears that the magical canon was conceived. From the high civilizations of the past came men and women whose exceptional creative and aesthetic abilities allowed them to not only construct formidably majestic pyramids and temples, but to see ahead in time and know what the future was to portend. This capacity is lost to most of us today, and those few who possess such abilities are, more often than not, deemed strange and suffer ridicule accordingly. Though the gifts of our kindly progenitors, the high arts of divination, have also been ridiculed and occluded by the advent of science and fundamentalist religion, they are not redundant and are, in fact, the very avenues to true wisdom and enlightenment. Enlightenment is, however, primarily about understanding the nature of the self. Self-realization is necessary before God-realization, wrote the great Vedantic masters. Know thyself were the words found inscribed at the site of the Delphic oracle in Greece. The oracles and diviners of old knew what our questions were going to be, and they knew how to provide us with the most fascinating tools in order to have answers. But how disappointed they would be to see how carelessly we have cast aside the compasses and the charts made for our safe navigation over the omnidirectional oceans, if you like, of time and fate. In any event, here we are, immersed in our furious and manic world, a world now receiving warnings about a nightmare list of forthcoming hazards, about terror and terrorism, ecocide, global warming, future shock, affluenza, and so on. And precious few are those commentators or thinkers who have anything positive to say in the way of real solutions. As I've mentioned on other programs in this series, the present millennia is a time for solution think, for finding simple grassroots remedies to age-old problems. This is certainly a time of challenge, but it can also be our most creative time. All we have to do is dispense with the hierarchies, conspiracies, and oligarchies which seek to keep us in ignorance while they progress from our energies and blind support. We find ourselves in the present debilitated condition due to the fact that we have been duped into placing our faith in orthodox religion and technology, rather than in nature and in our own abilities. As should be clear by now, orthodox religious dogmas have little to nothing to do with self-realization, and clear also that technology has likewise little to nothing to do with answering life's greatest questions. Christianity and the other religions exalt mind over the physical body, and science exalts left brain rational thought over right brain intuition and imagination. In fact, division and divisiveness are the mainstay of both ideologies, but especially of religion. Judeo-Christianity, like most fundamental and unsustainable religions, is replete with dichotomies and inequality. From beginning to end, we see nothing equal in the creation. A little reading, and we find that God is unequal to Lucifer, and that heaven is divided from hell, and that there is inequality among the angels and heavenly choirs. Adam is not equal to Eve, and Eve not equal to Lilith. Cain is not equal to his brother Abel. The 12 tribes are not equal in rank, and the prophets are unequal to the commoners, the Gentiles unequal to the Jews, the Pharisees, they're not equal to the Sadducees, the Jews not equal to the Romans, Christ not equal to the so-called Messiah, the Pope is not equal to his flock, and the priests are not equal to their parishioners, and so on. We have Protestant versus Catholic, and hundreds of denominations of the same religion, each despising the other. And yet, we are told to believe that the denomination we belong to is holy and possesses the whole truth, and that to go elsewhere is to jeopardize the very welfare of our souls, no less. Clearly, it is our misattribution of faith, which accounts for why multitudes are now finding themselves in a state of emotional, psychological, and spiritual angst, in an age in which there is materially more available to us than ever before. Our lack of attendance to the real questions of being also accounts for the delinquency and disenchantment among the youth, who feel more and more pressure to perform, to excel, and to overachieve. Well, we've taught them our bad habits, so they know exactly how to go along to get along, and what to think rather than how to think, and to do rather than to be. We replace life with lifestyle, and freedom with relative liberty. Our offspring are the barometer of our existential progress, the measure of the moral level and internal state of decay. Well, what alternatives are there, the viewer will ask. It is the mission of this series and this program to provide some insight into possible alternatives and to demonstrate that we still have before us sane spiritual practices which are older and richer than anything we've already been offered by our deviant clerics and politicians, who work overtime to make sure that we never discover that we are our own priests, our own priestesses, and who have so much to lose if we ever do awaken to inherit our own sovereign power. When we come into this world as children and begin our indoctrination process with parents and teachers, we are basically led to believe that there are no operating manuals to life, and that we get it together through trial and error as we go. However, nothing could be further from the truth. There are operating manuals. Their names are tarot, astrology, Kabbalah, and numerology. And these were, and still are, the mystery school curriculum. They are designed to not only help us to see into the future, but more importantly, to be totally and passionately aware in the present, in the now. They enable the mind to operate holistically and polyphrenically. They enable us to assist and educate ourselves and the others around us. And they are at our disposal anytime that we're ready to bring their magic into our lives. They were created in times past to help us navigate through the tempests of life, that we might arrive safely at our true destinations. As I often inform my audiences, the loss of our spiritual legacy did not occur by accident. It has taken centuries of manipulation, suppression, prohibition, and conditioning by dynastic interests and those who have a great deal to lose should ordinary people think and act as their ancestors once did. The ineffectual replacements for the orally transmitted high arts are the modern religions and sciences. In this program, we will be exploring the reasons for the rise of both and finding out that through our acceptance of these two worldviews, we slowly lost our intimate connection with the natural and organic, and with the living oracle, which exists within consciousness as a portal to our racial memory, to our Akashic record, which contains, like a mandalic fractal, the collective experiences and wisdom of the entire human race. This is the genetic library that contains the virtual epics and sagas of all humankind, the remote energetic scriptorium, if you will, which contains wisdom inaccessible to the linear perspectives of common scientists and theologians. And it is accessible via consciousness, the kind of consciousness which is imbued with reverence, simplicity, and humanity, and not by that corrupted by greed, vanity, and megalomania. It is a wisdom received and transmitted only by a consciousness which has been chastened, seasoned, and matured through many a test of purity, and which has withstood moral and spiritual assault and tribulation. The man in society who is out of rapport with the imagination body becomes mentally deranged and existentially vagrant. He becomes wordy and linear, aggressive and self-interested. He becomes time-bound and sensationalistic, enslaved in a world of appearances with no articulation or authenticity. Dreams, intimations, and visions, silence and nature are replaced with the clamor of thought, words, desire, noise, and machines. The image-starved populace, seeking to alleviate the systemic impoverishment they feel unconsciously, become compulsively addicted to those false oracles which their malign masters construct and bestow. Television, cinema, video games, sports, computers, and all manner of virtual realities become the chic thing. Now, it is the hyperspace of a digital kingdom which one turns to in order to be turned on. The emptying out of the ancestral reservoir of consciousness has brought into being a culture of artificial pastimes and vicarious identification. Nowadays, it is not who you are that matters, but what you own which does. Not what you lead, but what you follow that becomes your merit, and not what you create, but what you allow others to create for you, which provides your security. For all the great learning and expenditure, modern scientists still cannot build a pyramid, nor even lift 2 blocks used in a pyramid into place. Yet theirs is the vaunted intelligence, which can launch satellites into space, but which cannot prevent the hole in the ozone layer, which can engineer the microchip, but which cannot prevent people starving to death, which can offer genetically altered foodstuffs to countries which cannot afford to pay for it, and which is committed to seeking all the answers in a future which their own science then goes on to prove does not logically exist. Theirs is the intelligence which can send thousands to die in a war which has been convened based on lies, which despite their transparency are declared truths by those with so much to lose from the actual truth should it ever come calling. The questioning of such intelligence is the sane man's first call to arms. The study of such distorted thinking and such tyranny becomes a more profitable science, one worth the time, energy, and resource invested. Once the futility and flaws of such intelligence is recognized, the time comes for one to make a reverent return to a more pristine archive of wisdom, one created by men and women of the past ages who possessed a deep and abiding love of nature and truth, who craved no heavens and feared no hells, but who allowed nature to teach them all that was needed. For all the pulverizing hammers of myopic science and false religion, the foundations laid by our ancestors are as strong still as that of the physical pyramid. As the great Egyptian Sphinx herself appears to have survived gigantic floods and cataclysms, so has the sublime knowledge of the ancients survived the cyclones of lies and error that have swept over the world for generations. That knowledge is encapsulated in the tarot, the Kabbalah, and other high arts of divination. Indeed, damage has been done to these fine bequeathments, and so the first duty of the purist is diligent restoration. My own work within these subjects has been one of excavation and reconstitution, an attempt to peel away all the debris which encrusts the magical arts, so that they can resplendently appear before us in their original, pristine glory. Through most of the Origins and Oracles series, we have been looking for answers to some of the world's sorry problems, be those problems sociological, economical, or psychological. The whole idea being that maybe something that our ancestors were doing wouldn't help us, but the past may have secrets. I mean, the ancients must have been doing something right. You don't build pyramids and sphinxes, you don't create zodiacs and map the heavens and sail the high seas, and you don't come up with all of the cultural artifacts and traditions that we have today out of the blue with no intelligence. And this program is likewise an attempt to glean some of the understandings from the past that might help us and assist us in the modern world. But again, let's not doubt that our interest, our main calling, our main theme is the present day, the world in which we ourselves, the human race, is now finding itself. The Maya are talking about an end date, an end of history, an end of time. Many philosophers from previous ages, and even some today, are talking about the time of revealing, an age when the masks are finally going to be coming down and man is going to have to deal with his dysfunctions. In the past, we had rites, we had rituals, we had customs, we had a shamanic tradition that took care of those things and didn't let us get into the sorry predicament. And of course, we know that these shamans, the Gnostics, the oracles, they use certain tools like the divination arts in order to assist their brethren, their brothers and sisters, in that process of individuation and self-realization. Interesting thing about the tarot is that in a full tarot deck, there are 78 cards, but those who work with the tarot know that there's the major arcana. Arcana just means a quadrant of the heavens. There's a major arcana of 22 cards, and 21 is the full cycle, and then we come full circle to the 22nd card. So the number 21 is of great importance. We know that 21 anyway, and 22, 22 over 7, and 21 being 3 times 7, a prime number. The idea of coming full circle are very connected to these numbers. Pythagoras and Plato and the Greeks were very fascinated by 21 as a key master vibration. And here we are in the 21st century, approaching the 22nd. And these centuries go by in a blink of an eye historically. We might question, are we coming full circle? Are we returning? Are we involved in what Nietzsche called the eternal return? I've mentioned many times in this series that we're coming full circle to the period which I term solution think, meaning that again, we all must be familiar, you all must be familiar with what the problems are. We've had critics and pundits and activists and all sorts of malcontents and well-meaning individuals understanding that we have certain problems here, not only psychologically in the interior of man, but also socially. Of course, we understand if we're in the mystical tradition that there's a connection. We're going to look at that a little bit later. But here we are in the new century and the early part of it. We're in a time of solution think. And those solutions need not be complex. Those solutions need not need tweed suits and walnut tables and cameras and lights. Those solutions are grassroots solutions. Again, the solutions that were applied by the ancients. But again, precisely what were the ancients doing? What was the main tenet? What was the main thrust of their culture? Well, contrary to what we're told in the history books, it was the independence of the human being. Perhaps not socially. Perhaps when we look back, if history is manipulated enough, we can look back and say, oh, they all had no sense of individuality. They all lived in the commune. They all huddled together. This is, of course, the case perhaps with, yes, the rank and file. But in the esoteric tradition, to those whose consciousness was developed and awakened, the essence was serving humanity and serving your brother, yes, but also the full-fledged realization of yourself, who you are. In short, the idea that man is his own priest and woman her own priestess, and that one could be initiated into those roles. Like in childhood, we obviously as children need the steadying action of parents. You don't pop out into the world perfect, not even if you're Mozart. So you need a certain steadying action in the beginning. And on the road of enlightenment, on the road of self-realization, you may go through a period where you need the shamans of old, the wise ones, to guide you. But of course, those weren't punitive beings like we have today. These were very loving people who never blurred our sense of selfhood. So in the journey of enlightenment, yes, there's a time for steadying action, but then there's a time when that must be released and the individual flowers on their own. This is very much the theme of the ancient traditions. In the program, in this series, Astrotheology, we understood that there was 4 cults of the ancient world. We looked into that in great detail and discovered that before the religious enclaves that we have today, before this enormous Leviathan, there were the stellar and lunar paradigms, which were so much more egalitarian, so much more ecocentric, matrifocal. connected to flora and fauna, aware that nature is a teacher, that it has its own ordinances and its laws and its rules, where women held high office, not just domestically, but also spiritually, something they haven't enjoyed for thousands of years since. In the Celtic countries from which I come from, we have the Druids and the idea of the round table. But do you think that the individuals who were talking about round tables and circles and Druidic orders were unaware that you have to be in order within in order to have order without? Do you think that these individuals who didn't even permit themselves the luxury of cutting a single living thing with a sharpened blade, as the Druids, were not aware of the symbiosis between man and the universe, and that man has to be in harmony in his inner universe before he can even hope to have it outside? Well, why is it that these military so-and-sos and political so-and-sos that rule the world today, who claim to have all the answers, are rushing about in all sorts of psychic chaos, hoping that they're going to somehow wave a magic wand one day and the world is going to be in peace and harmony? Yes, it will be in harmony. There will be social order, but it will be a new world order. It will be an order of control, of dumbed down, drugged out, controlled, indexed non-individuals. Now, one can't study divination, one can't study goddess traditions, one can't study the ancient cults without the study of Egypt, the land of the alchemists. Egypt, which was known as Chem, K-H-E-M, it's where we get the word chemistry or alchemy from. Chem just means the black land. It's where the man's name Kenneth comes from, because Ken or Chem was the ancient name. In England, we have a region called Kent, K-E-N-T. It's actually a throwback to Egypt. And if you go to Kent, you'll find lots of Egyptian symbolism there in the land and so on, in the megaliths. But land, the black land, the sacred land where all the peoples of the world knew to send their young men or women for initiation to the Nile Valley. That if you wanted to become fully knowledgeable about the universe, both the interior universe and the external universe, it was to Egypt that you would be sent. As Solon, the father of Plato, spent time in Egypt amongst the priests. And perhaps it's rumored even by the greatest of scholars like Frederick Copplestone and Bradley that perhaps Plato and Socrates were just echoing the knowledge brought back by Solon and other travelers, other historians to the land of Egypt. Egypt was the great metropoli, the great cosmopolitan city culture of the ancients, upon which so much of our culture comes down, only we're not aware of it. Now, Professor Max Mueller, one of the greatest historians and antiquarians, said, no people, ancient or modern, has given women so high a legal status as did the inhabitants of the Nile Valley. Feminists need to understand this when they're doing their research on the whole problem of the gender dichotomy. It wasn't always like that, as Maria Gimbutas and Professor Bakofen have shown. Now, Mustafa Gadala, one of the greatest Egyptian researchers and also a revisionist, in his book Historical Deception, he echoes that and says the Egyptian women were entrusted with the civilization. The woman, princess, and not the male, was the legal heir to the throne, and the man she chose to marry would become the ruling pharaoh. We know this in Celtic mythology, and sure, all over the Sarmatians and the steppes of Russia, all the way to the Tartars, through into Mongolia. They're finding burial chambers, just like you find in Celtic Ireland, where not only the corpse is put in as a fetus position, but they're laid in a mound. The whole idea of putting the king, the great ancestor, after his death or his fall in battle, you'd inter him in a mound, a sacred mound, was to represent going back into the mother. The idea being that there's rebirth involved here. There's no such thing as death. In the Egyptian, you have the sarcophagi. And we all know the sarcophagi in which we see the mummies being laid. But do you know that on the inner side of the lid of the sarcophagi, there's the image of the goddess Nuth, the sky goddess, that's laid over the corpse? And the understanding that you're merging back again with not just the night goddess, but with the goddess, the eternal mother. Now, the Greek historian Herodotus, who spent lots of time in Egypt, said the Egyptians were the first to discover the solar year and to portion out its course into 12 parts, both the space of time and the seasons which they delimit. It was observation of the course of the stars which led them to adopt this division. It is also the Egyptians who first brought into use the names of the 12 gods, which the Greeks adopted from them. One of the greatest scholars of all time, the English writer and historian Godfrey Higgins, in his monumental work, The Celtic Druid, said that in science, the Greeks were pygmies. What they have known of science, if their Platos and Pythagoras's had not traveled to the east. Now, Ignatius Donnelly, the great Atlantean researcher of America, said, those Greeks that we regard as the fathers of mathematics were simply the pupils of Egypt. And Diodorus of Sicily says, the disposition of the stars, as well as their movements, have always been the subject of careful observation among the Egyptians. They have preserved to this day the records concerning each of these stars over an incredible number of years, the study having been zealously preserved among them from ancient times. And we understand also, to underline what he's saying, that there was an exoteric and an esoteric tradition. Yes, they handed down a lot of information, but they also sequestered and kept back from the uninitiated a vast amount of esoteric information.
And it's only a very few scholars in the world, like Godfrey Higgins and Swala de Lubitsch, for instance, perhaps, who've gone into that, because the way that the Egyptians saw the stars, the way they saw the connection from heaven and earth, terrestrial and celestial, the way they understood the mysteries of cosmos, being, and God, are not the same as we do today. We have language barriers. That's the least of the problem. We also have conceptual barriers. In the Kabbalion, it says, in ancient Egypt dwelt the great adepts and masters who have never been surpassed. Asclepius, in his Hermetic text, says, in Egypt all the operations of the powers which work in heaven have been transferred to earth below. It should be said that the whole cosmos dwells in Egypt. Gerald Massey again, he said, the retouching by the Greeks, like that of the Semites, tended to efface the figures or falsify the meaning of the mythos, and the astronomical facts are of 1,000-fold more important than all the petty embellishments of irresponsible fancy. He's saying they tweaked it, they changed it, they couldn't understand it, so they distorted it, they adapted it, but they adapted it in a very exoteric way. And as we proved in astrotheology, that action of contorting the canon, contorting the archive, can have the most serious effects, not just on the canon, not just on the archive, but on the minds that later come to read that travesty, that hybrid. Now, Cyril Fagan, in his Astrological Origins, points out the same thing. In their desire to appear highly intellectual, scientific, and mathematical, the Greeks, probably about the time of Alexander the Great, adopted the solar nomenclature, thereby turning ancient zodiacal symbolism topsy-turvy and making it sheer nonsense. That's right, Alexander the Great, that would be correct, because Alexander the Great invaded. That's why we have Alexandria, the city of Alexandria in Egypt. It was an invasion of the Greeks, who had the faintest idea in the wide world what the Egyptians were about and what they were doing. But for those of you who don't understand what it means by solar nomenclature, we haven't really the time to go into that. In astrotheology, we pointed out what that means, that there is ancient cults operating in the world that are the precursors to all the modern religions and governments of the world. And they very quickly are the stellar, the lunar, the Saturnian, and the solar cult. And no understanding of our times today, no understanding of history or the movement of tribes or language or racial theory or any of that can be understood without a knowledge of these cults. And the fact that you haven't heard about them says it all. There's a reason why you haven't heard of astrotheology and these parent subjects. There's a reason why you haven't understood and been told that the Christian religion, Judeo-Christianity, arises from 7 cults of the ancient world, 4 of which of those were incredibly powerful. There's been a lot of editing going on in the subject of history. And we're going to try and put that right to whatever humble extent we can achieve that. Now, Mustafa Gadala, in his book, The Exiled Egyptian, says that academic Egyptologists claim that they have deciphered and understand the ancient Egyptian language. But do they? Deciphering the ancient Egyptian language began with Champollion in 1822, but practically ended then. One can easily see the struggle of academia to understand the ancient Egyptian language, which reached a dead end, as is reflected in an apparent deciphering of no more than 1,500 words that have contradictory and confusing meanings. Even if we accept academically deciphered ancient Egyptian terms and names, which is equivalent to about 1,500 English language words and terms, this number is less than 1% of the vocabulary listed in an average English language dictionary. Well, it's such a small fraction. The evidence is clear that their whole effort was a sham. Oh, but that doesn't matter. The average Egyptologist and scientist and antiquarian and linguist is going to absolutely condemn you if you try to say that the Egyptians were into astrology, the Egyptians understood the meaning of life, the Egyptians were not primitive when they built the pyramid. These individuals who've barely deciphered 1,500 words are going to, as they have, lambaste, marginalize, sequester, and harass any scholar who makes a thorough, more detailed analysis, like Gerald Massey and Swala de Lubitsch and Godfrey Higgins and many others have done. We don't even want to get into what these individuals had to endure under the weight of the fundamentalistic approach. And yet here we find that such a small headway was made. How can they know what was really going on in the Egyptian mind when they can barely decipher their language? Esoteric and exoteric, meaning inner and outer, revealed and unrevealed. Von Moshheim says that the Egyptian priests had a sacred code of their own, founded on very different principles, he says, from those which characterized the popular religion. And it was studiously concealed from the curiosity of the public by wrapping it up in characters and meaning and powers which were only known to themselves. Sad thing is, that's still going on with the modern clergy today. They decide what they'll hand down to us from their pulpits. The Egyptian gods, quote unquote, represent human principles and proclivities. This has to be firmly understood. Their qualities and interrelations are encapsulations of the interpsychic dynamics. In short, they represent archetypes operating through the stereotypic domain. Okay, so when we really understand and we do our homework beyond the limitations that we get in the textbooks and official textbooks and official reports. When we really go to town with the whole concept of Egypt, some most remarkable theories come to light of how they understood not only the world around them with meticulous detail, but also the rhythms and patterns of the human psyche. And what do we find in the pantheon of these Egyptians? Because of course all the moderns, including the religious individuals, are saying, oh, look at those pantheon, they're pantheists, thousands of gods. So we needn't bother about them. They couldn't even decide what god to worship. Far from it. These gods represented human principles and proclivities, human aspects of the human being. Their qualities and interrelations are encapsulations of the inter-psychic dynamics. In short, they represent archetypes operating through stereotypic domain. They represent the interaction of the spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical levels. Many of the images on the papyri are iconic ciphers containing mathematical and geometrical secrets and sacred proportions and harmonics, which relate to the dimensions of the human body and the cosmos. Now, any of you that are into codes and puzzles and paradoxicons and that kind of thing will understand this, that you, of course, clearly you can use a symbol to connote something. Same in computer programming. Well, that's what the Egyptians were doing, only they were doing it on a vastly higher level. They were able to represent the most subtle of intellectual and spiritual concepts and nuances with these hieroglyphics. You might just see the pharaoh casting a net, catching birds. And everybody turns the page going, oh, how lovely, the pharaohs are hunting birds. Swallow the Lubitsch, Gerald Massey. These scholars have said, no, what the pharaoh is doing is controlling his own thoughts. The crazy thoughts of the mind that are non-stop. He's bringing them into order through that net. It's an image that shows you something that's going on intrapsychically, and that's just one small example. In short, because we haven't got the time to explore the beauty of this kind of thinking, but in short, as a little hermeneutic, we have the kneeling gods. If you ever see you'll always notice that the gods are either showed kneeling, standing, or in some other pose. Well, kneeling gods in this hermeneutic are representing the powers and laws of the earth, meaning they represent the body, the emotions, and the lower psychological nature of man. If a god is seen standing, it's possible that he represented the powers of and laws of the air and the sky, which would also represent, in the human context, the mind, the intellect, the reason, and the creative. If that god bore wings, if he was winged, then he represented non-physical, more abstract dynamics, perhaps spiritual, psychic, and archetypal levels and dynamics. And if the god was seated, then he represents fixed and embodied archetypes. And if the god is seen, or goddess is seen seated, as they often are, they might represent fixed or embodied archetypes. In the same way that in astrology we have the fixed, cardinal, and mutable signs of the zodiac. But of course the problem is that none of this matters because it's all past history for most of us, or it's just an idle curiosity. Now, Aesculapius says that the day is coming when the world will know nothing of the faith of the Egyptians. Our land will stand desolate. Tombs and the dead will be its only witnesses. O Egypt, nothing but the fables will tell of thy faith, and no posterity will believe them. In one sentence, the man has got it absolutely right. That's right. Only tombs and dust is the memory. And even if we dig up and find something remarkable, we don't believe it. We can't connect the dots. So far are we in our dark age. Now, those within the metaphysical and the magical and occult Gnostic communities don't buy into any of that. Of course, we understand that the Egyptians were the fathers of all civilization, and we know very much what they have bequeathed to us. Out of the many things that the ancients, like the Egyptians and the Celtic, the Vedic, and have bequeathed to us, probably the most important thing, or certainly in the Egyptian context, is what could be referred to as the magical Western tradition. Magical Western tradition? That's right. We know about the Eastern magical tradition. We know about all the gods that we worship there. We know about the different yogas. We know about a little bit about the different religions. And we certainly know about all the gurus on the banks of the Ganges and all the temples and idol worship and all of that. And it's been a fascination, especially since the 60s. There's been a sort of a fusion and emerging of that old world paradigm because it looks so wonderful and resplendent over here in our impoverished religious situation. When you look over there, it looks mighty exotic. However, the Indic philosophies are nothing more than the same thing. They're just Christianity under a different name. And those who study Brahmanism or any of these very patriarchal, hierarchical, and suppressive religions over there know that for all its pomp and ceremony and all its enigmatic and sort of mystery, it's basically Christianity by another name. So, but it's considered the Eastern world tradition. It's a fascinating subject and fascinating study. But what we don't perhaps understand too coherently in the West is that there's a Western magical tradition. Egypt is actually considered a Western country. And it passed on to us, it donated to us a completely coherent magical tradition for the spiritual uplift and right living and moral health or hygiene of the human being. So what is the magical Western tradition? Well, it's the tarot, it's astrology, it's Kabbalah, and it's numerology. 4 divination arts, 4 high arts of divination, all connected. But of course, in today's world, they're all disconnected. But originally they were connected. I put the tarot first in the list because I work with it myself, and I have to emphasize its peculiar brilliance. Of all the other divination arts, of its three sister disciplines, it alone uses composite images, iconic representations, pictures, and those have a very deep effect on the unconscious mind. It's a symbolically rich archive. Speaking of symbols, Mircea Eliade, the traveler and historian, said that the man who understands a symbol not only opens himself to the objective world, but at the same time succeeds in emerging from his personal situation and reaching a comprehension of the universal. Thanks to the symbol, the individual experience is awoken and transmuted into a spiritual act. The American occultist, Manly Palmer Hall, in his book Sages and Seers, says, nature about us uses the language of symbolism for the unfoldment of all the potential of its creations. The mysteries of life do not explain themselves or issue any dogmatic statement about their ways or workings. Simply put, the voice of God or the voice of the truth is speaking to us every day, but it's not going to talk louder than our racket. It isn't going to turn itself up. It doesn't have a volume switch. We have to turn our nonsense, our racket, our mayhem down, and then that still small voice will be ever clear. It's as simple as that. But as Manly Palmer Hall is pointing out here, symbols are also involved. Plotinus says, and Plotinus was a Neoplatonic philosopher, he said that the Egyptians, either by exact science or spontaneously, had arrived at a method by means of which they could write with distinct pictures of material objects instead of ordinary letters expressing sounds and phrases. These pictures were not ordinary images of the things they represented, but were endowed with certain symbolic qualities called Sophia, by means of which they revealed to the initiated contemplator a profound insight into the very essence of substance of things, and an intuitive understanding of their transcendental origins, an insight which was not the result of reasoning or mental reflection, but was acquired spontaneously by means of divine inspiration and illumination. As artistic representations of this phenomenal world, they revealed, in fact, the ideal world of the soul. So he's saying that the adepts know not to really try even to communicate in words. Of course, they can do it. But words refer to the monophrenic mind. That's a single, focused, narrow intellectual mind, not to the polyphrenic mind or the omnidirectional consciousness. So they preferred to use symbols. They also knew that by using symbols, not everybody would be able to interpret them. So you had to bring forth something from your own intelligence. You weren't just sitting there passive at a desk for 18 years under fluorescent lights, being spoon-fed what you're meant to think and believe. You had to bring something completely unique from inside yourself. And that would couple with the symbolic form of communication that was taking place. That was what real learning, real education was all about. This higher power in the universe also, as I said, it doesn't talk over our racket, but it also communicates to us in symbols and colors and rhythms and all sorts of ways other than words. Words are, phylogenetically speaking, a very recent form of communication in our world. So what do we understand about shapes and colors and platonic solids and vibrations and rhythms and numbers? There's a whole world of communication out there that we're barely involved with. Perhaps that could also account for the state that we're in. Now, you can't think of the tarot, certainly in a more modern context, without thinking of a particular period in history, namely the 1800s, the 19th century, the Victorian era, and of a certain order. That's the Order of the Golden Dawn, and of two very special individuals. One was MacGregor Mathers, the head of the Order of the Golden Dawn, and the other was the enigmatic and mysterious Edward Aleister Crowley. Now, Mathers devised Book T, or Book Tarot, the basis for the Rider-Waite Tarot, and was painted by a woman, Pamela Coleman Smith. And Aleister Crowley devised his Thoth deck, which was painted by Lady Frida Harris. So the women are artists. I've always found that more than interesting. But these two men from the Order of the Golden Dawn, master occultists, Mathers spending 30 years researching the esoteric tradition. Okay, we talked about the exoteric and esoteric. He studied the esoteric. And Crowley, by joining the Golden Dawn, was given Book T, because Mathers had that as a cardinal manifesto when you joined that order. You were obliged to read that. Crowley loved it, picked up on it, and went with it and created his own tarot. Again, esoteric. So these two individuals are responsible for holding over and getting the tarot back into shape, because for many generations, the tarot was not in its pristine form and had been misunderstood. The tarot, the word tarot is itself very enigmatic. The word tarot was pronounced, it was actually the name of the mother goddess of ancient times, Tarut, and it was pronounced with a soft H at the end, which is of course Taruth, thus giving us the familiar English word truth. The word tarot and the word truth are therefore the same. In the Anglo-Saxon eras, the strong T's at the beginning and end of tarot, that sound, that strong T sound, was softened eventually to CH. So instead of T, you have Ch. And of course, if you take the two T's off and put CH on either side, instead of Tarut or Taruch, you get Charuch or church. So the word church and the word truth and many other words come from this ancient mother goddess name of Taort or Tarut or Tarot. And there she is, the earliest symbol given to her by the ancient Egyptians was the hippopotamus god or goddess. There she is in the center of the zodiac, also at the northern point of the sky, up there in the sign of Cancer, near where Ursa Major and the pole star are. And in fact, that's one of the reasons today that the Christians, who know a great deal of this, only they don't tell us about it, refer to their church as Holy Mother Church. And church, that word, comes out of also the Greek circe. Circe was the female Circe, C-I-R-C-E, the magician, the wizard, the enchantress Circe, which the Scottish pronounce as Kirk with a hard K. K-I-R-K is Scottish, Celtic, Gaelic for church, Kirk. Now the tarot is the actual emerald tablets of Hermes. So when you hear all sorts of scholars and thinkers pontificating about the so-called emerald tablets of Hermes, and one day some wannabe Indiana Jones is going to turn over a rock somewhere, and there they are in the Syrian desert. Well, guess what? They've already been discovered, and they're the 78 cards of the tarot. Very simple. If you do your homework, that is conclusively proved that the tarot is the book of life and is the emerald tablets of Hermes. There is no other. As Madame Helena Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society writes, the alphabet of Thoth, and she's referring there to the tarot, the alphabet of Thoth can be dimly traced in the modern tarot, which can be had at almost every bookseller's in Paris. As for it being understood or utilized, the many fortune tellers in Paris who make a professional living by it are sad specimens of failures of attempts at reading, let alone correctly interpreting the symbolism of the tarot without a preliminary philosophical study of the science. So just in case any scientists are watching this program thinking, what's all this nonsense about tarot cards? Please understand that I am not referring to the normal fortune-telling gobbledygook and charlatanism that's out there. I am very serious about this. This is an archive, an heirloom from ancient times that has incredible geometric, numerical, astrotheological, and symbolic, iconic mysteries attached to it, which have hardly even been touched upon. As Aleister Crowley himself said in his Book of Thoth, the medieval pacts are hopelessly corrupt, or otherwise far from presenting the ancient truth of the book in a coherent system or shape of lucid beauty. He says that each card is, in a sense, a living being, and its relationship with its neighbors are what one might call diplomatic. It is for the student to build these living stones into his living temple. Ah, finally, a true magus. Right, the true teacher. We're not going to do anything for you. You're going to do everything for yourself. They provided the means. It's not didactic, it's not pedantic, it's symbolic, it's perfectly egalitarian, it's totally whole brain, and you sit down, you work with it, and you develop your own intelligence. But how threatening that is to us today in the world. We've given away our sovereignty, we've given away our intelligence, we've absolutely in full desire of letting other people do our thinking for us. Well, those times are changing. Now, A.E. Waite of the Order of the Golden Dawn, in his book, The Key to the Tarot, Part 2, says that the tarot embodies symbolical presentations of universal ideas behind which lie all the implicits of the human mind. And it is in this sense that they contain a secret doctrine, which is the realization by the few of truths embedded in the consciousness of all. And in Part 1 of that book, he says, the true tarot is symbolism. It speaks no other language and offers no other signs. Crowley, in his book Liber 777, says that the tarot is a language fitted to describe certain classes of phenomena and to express certain classes of ideas which escape regular phraseology. Madame Blavatsky again says the Wheel of Enoch, that's another word for the tarot, is an archaic invention, the most ancient of all. Eliphas Levi, and she's referring there to the French occultist, Eliphas Levi says, there was not a nation but had it, its real meaning being preserved in the greatest secrecy. It is a universal heirloom. He goes on to say, or Eliphas Levi says, that the antiquity of this book is lost in the night of time, and it goes back to an epoch long before Moses. It was written upon detached leaves, which at the first were of fine gold and precious metals. It is symbolical, and its combinations adapt themselves to all the wonders of the spirit. Altered by its passage across the ages, it is nevertheless preserved thanks to the ignorance of the curious. A lot of contention, a lot of debate, raging in tarot circles about who exactly created the tarot. It's like this perennial question mark hanging over everybody's head. And in my work, my simple answer is, well, why don't we just look at the cards? If you want, the tarot is so self-referential, how come it's never dawned on anybody to actually look at the cards, look at the pictures? The pictures themselves, as on my website, I go into great detail with that and in other presentations, but the tarot cards themselves clearly reveal where they come from. But just in case we need more proof, Jean-Baptiste Putois, in his History of Magic, talks about the Greek philosopher Iamblichus, who was traveling in Egypt and met with the adepts and the high priests and was taken below the Sphinx and the pyramid into inner chambers. They say that according to the ancient Greek philosopher, a series of 22 frescoes identical to the tarot's major arcana once adorned the walls of a secret underground gallery accessed through labyrinthine passages. Priests entered the subterranean passage through a door in the breast of the Great Sphinx. The frescoes lined each wall, were said to be flanked by Sphinx-like characters, 24 in all. lit by 11 crystal oil lamps shaped in the form of sphinxes. A sphinx was also prominently displayed in fresco number 10. That's Arcanum 10 of the Tarot. Now, Arcanum 21, the final pictogram in the series, depicted the 4 zodiac signs distributed symmetrically around a large wreath. And that's what you see today. If you go to any store and pick up the tarot, buy a tarot, and look at number 21, you'll see the 4 quadrants and the wreath. So what he's basically saying here is that thousands and thousands of years before the Chinese and before the medieval time and before the Italians and before the French and before the Gypsies officially, we have a tarot in almost precise order in Egypt. In fact, just as an anecdotal aside, the word gypsy comes from Egypt. The word gypsy, if you put an E on the front of that word, it's Egypsy. The gypsies were just originating from Egypt, or at least thought of themselves as originating there, meaning that they were keeping alive the old traditions and the studies of Egypt. Now, when we come to the testaments of the modern world, we know that the center manifesto of Judeo-Christianity is certainly the Bible, and we will be told that the Bible is based on the 5 books of the Torah, the Pentateuch of old, the Hebrew Torah. However, what we are definitely not told is that the Torah is based on the Tarot. In fact, they're the same word. They both mean law or way. They come from exactly the same word, law or way. That's why there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and there's 22 cards of the major arcana. That's why the Tree of Life has 22 paths on it, representing again the letters and the meaning. And because the Judeo-Christians in later era, as we saw in our show on astrotheology, didn't want to be connected to these ancient cults, they set about prohibitions like this one. In Exodus 20, we read in the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not make for yourself a graven image. The prohibition. A prohibition so important to them that it comes second. Number 4 is thou shalt not kill. Oh, but that was less important than thou shalt not make a graven image. Well, what is Egypt covered in? What is the ancient world covered in? Graven images of God, graven images of the mysteries of being. But that had to go. Now, Leonard Shlain, in his book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess, said that idol, that word comes from the Latin idolum, which comes from the Greek eidolon, which means image. So the sin of idol worship is the sin of making visual images. But we have, coming out of India, right from the earliest dynasties of the Dravidian culture in India, we have images of God, of Shiva, and the ancient god of the animals. And we have in Egypt, the countryside replete with the most elaborate images. All over the ancient world, man expressed his reality in images. Leonard Shlain says, he talks about this mental and behavioral schism. He says, I was struck by the thought that the demise of the goddess and the plunge in women's status and the event of harsh patriarchy and misogyny occurred around a time that people were learning to read and write. Perhaps there was something in the way people acquired this new skill that changed the brain's actual structure. And in our program on astrotheology, we saw that that is definitely the case. You don't just happen to do things like that and not have enormous consequences for thinking and for behavior. He goes on to say that literacy has promoted the subjugation of women by men throughout all but the very recent history of the West. He says, the second commandment forbids Israelites from conveying any iconic information. No illustrations, no colorful drawings, and no art. So far as we know, there has never before existed a culture that forbade representative art. Why should a prohibition against making images be the second most important rule for righteous living? According to the 10 Commandments, art, therefore, is more dangerous than murder. When we get a handle on this kind of a philosophy, when we get a handle on what this man is talking about, and what we've been presenting in this program and also in this series, we're going to suddenly get a window into, more than a window, more than a glimpse into the reason why things are the way they are. See, we may be looking at the big picture that's been presented for us, but we're missing the detail. In life, you have to watch where you're standing when you're viewing the canvas of reality. Maybe there's a problem if we're standing too close or we're standing too far away. You know, our vision can be distorted. We might be missing something very important. We have to get to the right position so we have the right perspective. Now, Jerry Mander says that the Hebrews emerging between 3000 and 2000 BC won an important political victory by denouncing what they called the worship of graven images. By destroying the power of the sculptures of the Sumerians and others who preceded them, they effectively destroyed nature-based religion and the veracity of images. This made possible the substitution of an abstract, single, male, human, all-powerful God. Because it was a sin to create any sculpture of it, it maintained its abstract nature. Of course, we know later on they had to bend the rules a little bit and come up with an image of Jesus Christ because the whole plan wasn't working. They had to concede a little bit. And we're not only implicating Judeo-Christianity here. The Islamic people are equally intolerant of images and went around chopping and carving and chipping away at all these images for their own purposes in Egypt. Look at the period of the Dark Ages. Scholars like Leonard Shlain are now thinking about it. They're thinking, hang on here, is there some connection between the coming of the Dark Age, which just follows this Renaissance? Well, the printing press was created by Johannes Gutenberg in 1454. William Caxton brought his press into England in 1476. Is there some sort of, is history trying to tell us something here? That's right, the bicameral mind, by using words, language, written words, as the sole means of communication. Blocking, sequestering, stopping, preventing the other kinds of communication. We literally had a mental shift. We start using the frontal lobes more, or to use more jargon, we moved into a left brain type of thinking pattern, cognition, which is more linear, rational, hyper-focused, and also more aggressive. But what damage we did to ourselves. It turns out that now slowly scientists are starting to discover that the brain works in a very different way. In fact, they've discovered that there are 240,000 miles of neural threads in the human brain. That's enough to stretch from the Earth to the moon. On every micrometer of these threads, there exist 250,000 units of information. But this data is recorded only as pictograms, as composite images, and not as words. But we didn't need scientists to tell us that. When you think of what you were doing 2 Fridays ago and that incredible party on the beach, you're not thinking in a series of words. Well, I hope not. I hope you're not thinking in a ticker tape marquee of sentences. You're thinking of the image. You're thinking of things that are even quite unrelated. You're thinking of all the peripheral things that went on. Your memory is bathed in your insubstantial light of mental thought. And there's all sorts of permutations and visions and emotional qualities and tonalities to that. So now can we understand that when we are being slowly, gradually, not overnight, but through the centuries, channeled into denying that part of ourselves, that image-making quality, what damage it could do, that we now find ourselves in the post-industrial age of crime, delinquency, and addiction. Now the tarot again, specifically, I have discovered that the tarot, in my work, I found that it relates to a whole plethora of other great mysteries. There's connections directly to the Egyptian, Hebrew, Celtic, and English magical alphabets. That's right, they're magical alphabets. There's links to what we know as the Kabbalistic tree of life, to the chakra system, to the alchemical process, to the sacred numerology, whether that be Pythagorean or some other kind. There's a connection between the tarot and the orbit of the luminaries and the planets, to the phenomena that we're going to look at a little bit later called the precession of the equinoxes, to Jung and his concept of human individuation, to the yearly maturation of the human being. The yearly maturation of the human being from age 1 all the way up to whenever. The tarot cards demarcate those zones. To the personality types, to the zodiac, to the sequence of historical centuries from the 1st to the 21st. Meaning that if you associate a card, if you know what you're doing and you associate a major arcana card with each of the centuries, that card clearly depicts the main events of that particular century. It encapsulates for you the details that we know even in a purely general historical way. And also there's connections to the periodical table of elements and to several other exoteric and esoteric phenomena. As Madame Blavatsky wrote, the tarot contains indeed the mystery of all such transmutations of personages into sidereal bodies and vice versa. She's saying, from heaven to earth, it is a vehicle, it vehicleizes, it's like a sort of catalyst between the human being, his consciousness, his mind, and the external world, and to the subtle mysteries of the inner world also. But that's right. To back up what I was saying about the yearly maturation, if you put out just the 22 cards of the major arcana in front of a young child or a teenager and ask them to pick a card that represents how they happen to be feeling as they're going through puberty, chances are they're going to pick the Hanged Man, which is card number 12. Well, card number 12 and card number 13. It's known that at 13 years of age, you start secreting the hormones for your adulthood. Number 13, that card relates to Scorpio and to those biological processes. 12, the cards 12 and 13 seem to match or represent the process known as puberty and many other biological and psychological processes. And of course, those who have a familiarity with tarot have often been wondering what is the exact connection between the tarot, say, and the zodiac. There's known to be a connection because lots of the tarot cards have zodiacal signs on them. Some tarot decks show you the astrological signs and symbols. So there seems to be a connection. Some of the cards themselves seem to be literally based on signs of the zodiac, like the one for Leo, which shows a lion. Well, there's a connection in the numerology. There are 12 signs of the zodiac, and there's 78 cards of the tarot. The interesting connection is that if you add all the numbers between 1 and 12, that's 1 plus 2 plus 3 in what they call the digital fashion, and you get to 12, you'll find that it equals 78. So even though the numbers seem different on the surface, people go, oh, there could be no connection between these 78 cards and the 12 houses of the zodiac. There is a connection, but it's a little bit more Pythagorean. It's a little bit more subtle. Why are there 78 cards? Scholars are always talking about it. Again, if you want to know a mystery about the tarot, you go to the tarot. If you pull out the 7th card of the tarot, you'll find that it's called the Chariot, and it's ruled by the moon, and it relates to the sign of Cancer. That's the 8th card, and it's ruled by Leo. It's called Strength. It rules the sign of Leo, which is ruled by the sun. Oh, wait a minute. Card 7 is ruled by the moon, and card 8 is ruled by the sun and the moon coming together. So 7 and 8 as a number were known to the ancients to represent the sun and the moon. And of course, just like the yin yang, or the coming together of the male and the female, the black and the white, the heaven and the earth, the lower man and the higher man. This was the most important thing to the ancients, is the unification of opposites. And that's what the number 78 means, the house of the sun and the house of the moon, the coming together by unity, Shiva and Shakti, all opposites joined to one. So now what do you think when you hear about people going out and making decks of 101 cards, and no, this person's got one of 67 cards, and let's add another few cards there or take a few away? That comes from an exoteric understanding of these subjects. One hasn't done enough homework, one doesn't realize that there are inborn ordinances and rules to these things. And if you destroy them, you can create disharmony. I would go so far as to say that I've already said it, that the tarot is the actual book of life. Well, in the book of Revelations, we hear John talking about the Bible, which is put before us as the book of life. But I think that passage can be transferred or transposed to the tarot. In the Bible, it says, if any man shall add unto these things, God shall add unto him the plagues that are written in this book. And if any man shall take away from the words of this book, of this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book. In my particular work with the tarot in classes and tutorials and online and that kind of thing, my approach to the tarot is very grassroots. It also happens, one of its incredible mysteries is that your own birthday, your date of birth, relates to certain cards in the tarot. And your introduction to the tarot can be had through your own personal chart. Who knows you better than you? And we call those cards the personal significators. And there's a right way and many wrong ways to find them. And more poetically, the tarot may be likened to a cathedral. The cards are the stained glass windows, let's say, replete with symbolic imagery. The spreads that the cards go in are the light of varied intensities emanating through these windows. And you, the reader or the adept, are sort of interpreting the different light that comes through those windows when you give a reading to your client. Ultimately, it's the guide of the client that's giving the reading. You're just a vehicle for what their guides are actually saying. Same way that a doctor uses a thermometer. There's no mystery, there's no magic to it. It's a procedure. And if it's done right, the right answers will be revealed. Now we can turn to the other great part of the Western magical tradition that the Egyptians have bequeathed us, which is referred to as the zodiac. We know clearly that the Celts and the Maya and the ancient people were fascinated by the heavens and the stars. That's self-evident. The Aztecs and the Maya have left us their calendars. The Egyptians referred to the zodiac as the scroll of life, or also as the girdle of Isis. It was the original round table. That's what Camelot means. Camelot, if you decipher the etymology, means cam, like a camshaft to go around, and Camelot, the revolving castle. The revolving castle is nothing more than the Care City, which is the zodiac. In Revelation 12, and there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head the crown of 12 stars. That's right, Mother Mary, the crown of 12 stars. Very inexplicable to a Christian, but perfectly explicable to those who know it. Well, it's Mary now, but it was Isis yesterday, and it was Tarut before that. The woman with the crescent moon at her feet and the 12 stars in her head, and the baby in her arms. Now, what do we have to understand about the difference between the tarot specifically and astrology? There are many things, but one of the most important, I think, again, has to do with the goddess tradition and the suppression of the female. We have what, in astrology, the masculinization of certain signs of the zodiac. You look at the signs of the zodiac, a lot of them are male. It turns out that if you go to the tarot, they preserve the feminine original. We know that a masculinization policy is part of this contamination process that happened down through time. You see, we must understand this, that those forces that became Judeo-Christianity and the solar cults would not just go through the world, butchering, massacring, and laying entire nations to the sword, burning witches, molesting oracles, desecrating the oracles and the shamans of old, and suppressing the Gnostic canon, and then let the arts that these people were studying be in perfect, pristine condition, since that was what they were after in the first place. So if we find astrology and tarot in existence, anybody with 2 brain cells knows that it can't be in the pristine form. Maybe they've been tampered with, maybe they've been tweaked, maybe they've been changed. And in fact, when you do your homework, you find that they have. They're not in the pristine form. So one has to be a purist, an archivist, and go back and say, what has been tampered with? What's been contaminated? What's been taken away? Why is this over here so complex? Why do we need so much extra paraphernalia? But on a more simple level, there's been a masculinization of the astrological signs, specifically with Sagittarius, with Libra, with Aquarius, and with also Pisces. We find that in Sagittarius, we know that's the man, the archer, the centaur, the man with the bow. But the tarot card that relates to Sagittarius is the female angel holding the 2 chalices. Libra, which is now, of course, no female in it at all. They just give you the scales, the balances. But the tarot card for Libra shows the female queen enthroned. In Aquarius, if your star sign happens to be Aquarius, you'll know that your symbol is the man with the water pitcher. But guess what? The tarot card shows the original symbol of the female with the water urns. And this is a symbol that goes back many, many thousands of years. And Pisces, which they show as the fish, also had the countenance of the female goddess Isis weeping her tears over the loss of her consort Osiris. And by the way, on my website, I have a full analysis of the Egyptian origin of the tarot for those who are interested. Now, Richard Tharnes, PhD, is one of the moderns who's connecting the dots. He says that psychology textbooks of the future, of future generations, will look back on modern psychologists working without the aid of astrology as being like the medieval astronomers working without the aid of the telescope. He's right for two reasons. One, it is ridiculous that they're not using it. And two, they should be using it because it is much more powerful than some of the methodologies that are being used today. It encapsulates all of Freud's discoveries and all of Jung's discoveries were originally in the tarot. The 16 court cards represent the 16 personality types and so on and so forth. Now, what we have to understand about the zodiac, and something which is central to my work in this field of the divination arts, is that the zodiac is in fact not an external phenomenon. It's not out there in the sky. And there's no magic rays coming from any rocks floating in space that are affecting your destiny or your fate. Those magic rays and those influences have never been discovered. They have not been discovered in the past, and they will never be discovered because they don't exist. The mystery of how the zodiac relates to consciousness is still to be unraveled. My work is a central part of that revelation. But in short, what we need to understand is that the zodiac is an inner apparatus. It is an inner psychic phenomenon. I call it the living zodiac. As Friedrich Nietzsche so correctly said, as long as you still experience the stars as something above the head, you will lack the eye of knowledge. In fact, again, we just need to look to the word. The word zodiac comes from the Greek word root zaun, which meant living beings. That's how the ancient artists always showed originally the zodiac was in proximity to the human form. Down through the ages, somebody knew this. The old stellar cult people were completely aware, had no problem grasping that the zodiac was an extension of human consciousness. You might find the faintest idea what those terms even mean. Still thinking that it's hunks of rock out in space with these bizarre aspects and conjunctions that is affecting your inner spiritual development. Nothing would have been so preposterous to the ancients of the world to think that material substances outside you have any relevance to your own personal individuated experience. This is the contaminated form of astrology that I was talking about that's been handed down to us by those murderers of civilization, the Vatican and other edifices. But man was always shown in proximity to the signs of the zodiac. Here's the Christ, or the enlightened one, in the middle of the 12 signs of the zodiac. He is the 12 signs of the zodiac. We find that even later in the Grecian and Latin periods with the great scholar Pico della Mirandola and Agrippa. And the fact that even the children have noticed that the sun and the moon has a human face on it. Why do we buy that image? And we love that image of the face, the sun and the moon with a face on it. It comes from the same idea we're talking about. Now, of course, the true scholars know this. Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky says that when the planets of the solar system are named or symbolized, it must not be supposed that the planetary bodies themselves are referred to, except as types on a purely physical plane of the septenary, that's the sevenfold nature of the psychic and spiritual worlds. As Swallow de Lubitsch said in his book Sacred Science, it is erroneous interpretation of astrology to opine that special forces emanate from the planets and the stars. And probably the greatest scholar the world has ever known, Carl Gustav Jung, said that there are many instances of striking analogies between astrological constellations and psychological events, or between the horoscope and the characterological disposition. Astrology, like the collective unconscious with which psychology is concerned, consists of symbolic configurations. The planets are the gods, symbols of the power of the unconscious. He says the collective unconscious appears to consist of mythological motifs or primordial images, for which reason the myths of all nations are its real exponents. In fact, the whole of mythology could be taken as a sort of projection of the collective unconscious. We can see this most clearly if we look at the heavenly constellations, whose originally chaotic forms are organized through the projection of images. This explains the influence of the stars as asserted by astrologers. The influences are nothing but unconscious introspective perceptions of the collective unconscious. As we know, he says, science began with the stars, and mankind discovered in them the dominance of the unconscious, the gods as well as the curious psychological qualities of the zodiac, a complete projected theory of human character. And I would like to add to that, that then, since this man is already advancing this most remarkable concept, let us not then dupe ourselves into thinking, oh, but of course the ancients weren't aware of all of this. Oh, the ancients were completely aware of what he was talking about. They didn't just come about with it, of an evening when there was nothing to do. The zodiac is steeped in antiquity. They knew what he was talking about and much more. They were the alchemists of old, the high magi, the builders of the pyramid. Dennis Elwell, astrologer, writer, he says, the idea is to demonstrate that the zodiac is an archetype, not only within the collective unconscious, but within the fabric of reality itself, as a ground plan of creation. This archetype has not been invented. It exists. A knowledge of it has been developed in step with the evolving human consciousness. The scientists are now discovering that we have 12 cranial nerves, so that these thinkers may be correct, that there's something within the psyche that has 12 divisions. I talk about this in my presentations on the tarot and show how the whole development of consciousness is based on a 12-fold pattern or template. But this is now being discovered that there are 12 cranial nerves in the human brain, and they surround the tabernacle or the temple, which is the center. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, America's great astrotheologist, said that thus the inner meaning of our mortal life was endlessly repeated in the daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly cycle of the sun's passage, the 7 or 12 divisions of which mark the 7 or 12-fold segmentation of our spiritual history. He says the above, or spiritual, was mirrored in the below, the material. Heaven was reflected in earth below. Matter was the blank slate, the tabula rasa, on which spirit wrote its message, stamped its archetypal thought images. Projected from the cosmic mind, the ideograms congealed in matter and stood in concretion before the eye of man. He's talking about the relationship between the stereotypical and the archetypal, that something archetypal knows or has a relationship with the stereotypical. And of course, we might confuse those two things, as we often do. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, in his The Great Myth of the Sun God, says that Dr. George W. Cryle of the Cleveland Laboratories announced that he had discovered at the heart of every living organism a tiny nucleus of energy, all aglow, with temperatures ranging from 3,000 to 6,000 degrees of heat, which he called radiogens, or hot points, precisely akin to the radiant energy of solar matter. He affirmed that a tiny particle of the sun's power and radiance was lodged within the heart of every organic unit. That's right, the light is already inside of you. The light is powerful as the sun's. If the ancient Vedic masters had been talking about that, we would have thought they're stoned, they're crazy. And here are the top scientists talking about it. But guess what? As early as 1934, Wilhelm Reich had already seen it. Dr. Wilhelm Reich had already seen the very energy that is the gateway or the bridge between the cell, the human cell, and the energy matrix. And we're told that by even the Orthodox religions of the world, that the light is within, the temple of God is within, that man is the light of the universe. And we're also told that the Son of God has 12 helpers, implying that there are 12 making up the body politic. We find out from the New American Encyclopedia, a very astonishing but very true revelation, that the word Christ actually meant the anointed. But anointing was an ancient custom throughout the East. By pouring aromatic oils on persons as a token of honor, it was also employed in consecrating priests, prophets, and kings, and the places and instruments appointed for worship. In ancient Palestine, it seemed that kings, political and military chiefs, village heads, and in fact any claimant to high office were anointed, and hence called the anointed ones. Some, after anointing, then became called Lord. So the Christ is not unique. Every one of us is the Christ. And wouldn't you know it, occasionally from inside the Cabal, this is mentioned. According to Bishop Epiphanius, the Christ is the spiritual self within each person. I want you to bear that in mind, because we're going to be talking about that again a little bit later. And to hear the good bishop is absolutely telling us, forget about the physical biography, you are it. And Plato sums it up in relation to the zodiac. He says, perhaps there is a pattern set up in the heavens for one who desires to see it, and having seen it, to find one in himself. But of course, the Leviathan, the political power dynamic, would have nothing of it. They don't want you knowing that you're the Christ and you're enlightened and you have all the power within yourself. What would business be like if that was the philosophy? So the early church fathers prohibited astrology, and the Council of Toledo banned it forever. Nevertheless, 600 years later, the dates of the Pope's coronation were determined by the zodiac. The church hierarchy employed their own astrologers, and signs of the zodiac appeared all over church furnishings, tiles, doorways, manuscripts, and baptismal fonts. Remember, we were talking about what they allow you to know and what they know? And in astrotheology, another program in the series, we very much brought that out, that they prohibit you and your fellows from empowering yourself, from getting readings and empowering yourself through these incredible arts that your forefathers have handed down. But you can sure bet they're going to use it. They even use it on their church design, in their stained glass windows. Everything they do is based on divination, because they want to be empowered. The very clothes, the robes they wear. In astrotheology and sidereal mythology DVD, we went into that and showed you how they use the names and terms and images and iconography coming from the ancient world. Not only are there the 12 stages of astrology, but in alchemy, we have the 12 processes, the 12 levels of the stages of alchemy, the magnum opus, 4 lower levels and 3 higher levels. We have the 12 tribes of Israel, again, based on the zodiac. And let us not forget that in Egypt, in the Giza complex, let us not forget the very fact of the geometry. Why was that geometry chosen? A 3 and a 4, a base of 4 and sides of 3. That makes 12. Now, it's very easy to rebut or detract or deconstruct. The difficulty in life is being able to construct, to put something back, or to reveal. We're talking about some kind of a campaign of denudation, of suppression. But why? What is it that was being taken away from man? What's the whole purpose of this? Originally in magic, in theology, in religion, in yoga. What was the core of it all? What's it all about? Well, what it's all about is androgyny. And I don't mean androgyny on just a genital level. It has to do with spiritual androgyny. When we look at the word matrimony, we find that it comes from the word for the moon, that's Mon, and Mayat, was the goddess of balance. So in Egypt, the goddess of the scales of perfect equilibrium was known as Mayat. In fact, her hieroglyphic also stood for 1/2 or 0.5. So anything split down the middle. She was the goddess of balance, or the goddess of equilibrium, goddess of homeostasis, and the goddess of symmetry. Very important. And primarily, she was also the goddess of universal justice, the principle of universal justice. And her symbol was the feather and the scales of justice that are still used on the halls of justice today. Matrimony literally means the coming together of Venus and the moon, the coming together of opposites in perfect harmony, the sun and the moon, for instance. And this was an extremely important phenomena in the ancient world. Joseph L. Henderson, in his Ancient Myths and Modern Man, says that man's knowledge, that's logos in the Latin, then encounters a woman's relatedness, or eros. And their union is represented as that as a symbolic ritual of a sacred marriage, which has been the heart of initiation since its origins in the mystery religions of antiquity. This merging together, especially in alchemy, or in the alchemical world, is known as the chemical wedding. Now, Ajit Mukherjee, in his book Kundalini, says, in surrendering, we become feminine, the feminine depths of oneness, and a tremendous energy is released. From the tantric point of view, the consummated human being is a man and woman fused into a single unit. So the idea of the Buddha, scholars like Camille Paglia have noted that the body shape of the Buddha is very feminine, and the long ears and so on, just the iconography and the way the eyes are. And there's a undercurrent, a theme pertaining to androgyny, that there's a loss of masculinity. There's the unification of opposites involved in the yogic process. And Rajneesh, that's Osho, the mystic from India, says that tantric sexual union is falling in love with the whole cosmos. It is a total surrender to the whole cosmos. But we don't want to surrender to the cosmos. We want to dominate the cosmos. We want to murder and eviscerate nature, right? Isn't that the game plan? Isn't that the new religion in town? Now, in the Kandam Har Osana Tantra, we read that along with Gopa, he exercised bliss. By uniting the diamond, scepter, and lotus, he attained the fruit of bliss. Buddhahood is obtained from bliss, and apart from women, there will not be bliss. The man sees the woman as a goddess, the woman sees the man as a god. By joining the diamond, scepter, and lotus, they should make offerings to each other. There is no worship apart from this. It's the old eyes of the dragon, the yin-yang. Within the white is contained the black. Within the black is contained the white. Yin-yang are just Far Eastern words for the masculine and the feminine principles that are not considered opposites in the mystical tradition. Now, Clement of Alexandria, the church father, in his second epistle said, when the two shall be one, the outside as the inside, and the male and the female, neither male nor female. He's talking about enlightenment, talking about the coming of heaven. Here's a church father. Remember we said they have something they're not telling you. They operate on secrets that you might never become privy to. They know all about androgyny. In the medieval period and in the Renaissance, there was a fascination with this concept as well, realizing that man is a bipolar entity. He has the nipples of the female, and there's a Y chromosome, the X chromosome. There's an understanding that man is both male and female. In India, they always used to show one god with 4 arms, which implies, of course, that there's 2 beings in one, in Shiva Nataraj. In the Gospel of Thomas, this is a Gnostic gospel. That means one of the books that was left out of the Bible on purpose because it revealed too much. We read that Jesus in that book says, if 2 make peace with each other in this one house, they will say to the mountain, move away, and it will move away. A little bit different than the Beatitudes, a little bit different than the Gospels. Now the story is a little bit more enigmatic. If 2 become one in the same house, then you'll have all the faith in the world to move the mountains. In the Celtic mystical tradition, this also was center place. Abergahain, the first bard of the Celtic people, who was the pre-accuser to Merlin, said, "Who but I telleth the ages of the moon? Who but I showeth the resting place of the sun?" In his great poem, he's literally showing you that he and nature are completely unified. Now, another one of the great Christian thinkers, John Scotus Erigena, said in his work that Lord Jesus united in himself the division of our nature, that is, male and female. For in him there is neither male nor female, although it was in the masculine sex that he was born of a virgin. So here's one of the leading Christian thinkers and philosophers literally telling you what we never hear from the pulpit, what we never hear in Sunday school. We're given every other story with no explanation, but here the insiders know that the very image of Jesus was of androgyny, that he had partaken in a chemical wedding. But of course, artists have always portrayed the Christ in an androgynous manner. The Indians, the Vedic people, always spoke about the unification of Shiva and Shakti. Shakti is a female goddess, but Shakti, the word also means energy. And when you see Shakti turning back towards Shiva, Shiva is calling his energy back from the world into himself. And mantras, mandalas, the study of symbolic images again. There wasn't a set procedure in the early days. What you did was you meditated on an image. You meditated on a mandala or a yantra, and that was meant to help you or assist you on the process of this unification. Again, in the ancient East, emphasis on imagery. Now, in the Gospel of Thomas, again, we read very clearly about this principle. When you make the two one, and when you make the inside as the outside, and the outside as the inside, and the upper as the lower, and when you make the male and the female into a single one, so that the male is not male and the female not female, and when you make eyes in the place of an eye, and a hand in the place of a hand, and a foot in the place of a foot, an image in the place of an image, then shall you enter the kingdom. As I said, this was known to the occultists of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, from the Pythagorean days, coming down through the occult tradition. We have this enigmatic statement about how to make the philosopher's stone. The Agrippa says that make a circle of the man and woman. In the circle, make a square. Within the square, make a triangle, and you will have the philosopher's stone. Again, talking about taking dissimilar ideas, the circle and the square and the triangle, and the male and the female, and uniting them in a particular methodology, of course. And there you will have the philosopher's stone. So we can see that there's this thread of interest running through yoga, religion, mysticism about androgyny. How come we have never heard of this? How come this all sounds completely strange and foreign? Because from day one, we have been not told this. We have had this information hidden from us. So we don't even know where the A to Z, we don't even know how to get to point A about what this could possibly mean. In Egypt, the sky goddess Nuth mating with the earth god Jeb was the reason why clock towers and columns and obelisks were put in the cities, reaching up into the heavens, in order that sidereal, the world of the sky, and the world of Terra, the earth, would be linked. In astrotheology, we went into a lot of those motifs. The crossing of the right hand over the left side and the crossing of the right hand, the left hand over the right hand side was, again, as you see with the pharaohs, that crossing was a symbol of androgyny, that the pharaoh is both male and female. Pharaoh, the word, is Greek for pharos nous, meaning enlightened mind. And the crook and the flail, contrary to what we're told in these preposterous history books, these have nothing to do with slave trading and keeping the slaves in check. This has to do with keeping the side of oneself in check, that egoic or limbic side. The flail is held over the left-hand side, because the left-hand side was considered the earthy side that might drag the soul down into lower drives. And the crook is the symbol of mercy. It's the shepherd's crook, that we have to have a severe and a merciful aspect to ourselves, that the mind is already like that. We have a punitive and a permissive side. Freud discovered the same thing later on about the prohibitive and the permissive side of the superego, our conscience. The pharaoh is the shepherd to himself. He uses the whip on his own being, not on somebody else's. It's such a strong motif that Madison Avenue, who have a fascination for headless women in poses of death, are sure to have you realize that this androgyny, they'll sell you anything using that imagery. They'll not upraise you. They're not going to talk to you about chemical weddings and unification and freedom and liberation. No, but they want to sell you some bar of soap or some jewelry. They'll certainly want to use the ancient symbols of androgyny, because they know you're screaming for it inside your unconscious mind. The religious symbolism used to sell you toothpaste or whatnot. The idea of the androgyne, the male and the female united, is a very, very powerful motif that the controllers and the manipulators of the world know well how to use to further rape you. It's an enigma that our soul is craving for understanding of. What is gender? Where do we stand? And all the sickness of the world, all the depravity and crime come out of not being able to have guidance in these things, not being able to understand what the question of gender is. All the perversity that surrounds us in the world that's dragging the whole planet into perdition arises from what we're talking about here. We can only do a cursory overview of these themes. And the other program in this series, the subversive use of sacred symbolism in the media, you spend more time going into Madison Avenue and the corporate aspect of this perversion, this manipulation. In the Gospel of Thomas, we read, "For every woman who makes herself male will enter into the kingdom of heaven." That line is spoken by the Christ in a book that was considered in the ancient world equally, if not more important, than the Bibles that are given to us today. I put the tarot card there because I want to emphasize that the tarot is very much about this process. It is, in fact, the doctrine. I was saying just a few minutes ago how we're not left with any instruction manual or any kind of guidance into this process. Well, in fact, that's not quite true. We do. The divination arts are the methodology. They provide the rungs of the ladder and the map and the compass, the tools that we need to navigate this particular mystery. But this was a fact known to some of the greatest men of our time. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, not only one of the greatest English poets, but also one of the greatest literary geniuses of our time. He said the great mind must be androgynous. And emphasize yet again that somebody knows this. Why is it that the doors of the churches into which we go every Sunday are shaped like the female vagina, the female opening? Why do we have all that symbolism of the water, the holy water? All of these symbols that we show in astrotheology, that program, we show how it all comes out of the ancient world, representing the female, for this very simple reason. You cannot totally have somebody suppress their sexuality and their gender. To do that causes instant pathology. You want to suppress the instincts, you need to suppress these drives, but if you do it too much, we've got insanity let loose. And of course, the slave is no good if he's insane. So we need to give back in surrogate the same thing that you're taking away with the other hand. And that is the plan of Christianity. That's exactly what Judeo-Christianity is doing. It sells you back what you're missing, what you're aching for, in a subliminal surrogate manner. And the study of that is most fascinating. It's all right to have vagina-shaped headdresses. It's okay to dress in the flowing robes of the female. It's all good. It's all fine to have the churches referred to as Holy Mother Church and have the sacred salt waters used in baptism and all the rest of the imagery that even the evangelists use when they dunk you in the water and whatnot. But they're never going to give you the thing in its purest form. We even find that there was no cult of the Virgin Mary in the earliest centuries of the church because they wanted to completely suppress it. There's no mention of Mary's name nor reference to her occurs in the notices of the Holy Communion in the New Testament, nor in the liturgical thanksgiving of the first epistle of St. Clement of Rome, nor in the Didache, nor in Justin Martyr's or Tertullian's account of the Eucharistic services. The only place where an invocation of St. Mary could come is at the commemoration of martyrs and the commemoration of the departed. And on this, all that St. Cyprian has to say is that there is no direct evidence that among the martyrs, the Virgin was so much as mentioned. So all you Catholics out there, just remember that this was not natural to Christianity. They realized the plan of control wasn't going very well. So they had to stoop to the old paganistic representative art. They had to give you back Jesus as an image. They had to throw a few stained glass windows around, and then they had to finally concede. Originally, the Trinity was a Holy Spirit. Mary was not brought in as the fourth part of that, wasn't made part of the quaternity until a lot of debate. But they realized it wasn't working. The total absence of the feminine was something that wasn't natural, wasn't organic. So they had to concede. So they gave us back the very passive image of Mary that you worship, and the very passive image of Eve, tinted, of course, by the fact that she caused all of our problems in the fall. Of course, we know that. But all of the females that are presented to us are either literally temptresses or fools. And for centuries, we've never seen anything wrong with that picture. Now, the introduction of Mariolatry, that's the worship of Mary, was sometime later from the introduction in the Eastern rites. Okay, so it was the Eastern Christian church that started taking to it first. After the church was adopted by the Roman Empire, the heathen practice or heresy was adopted, and the practice is recorded by Epiphanes. By the medieval period, up to the close of the Council of Trent in 1563, we see that Mary had been elevated in the liturgy, being mentioned by name now as the Most Holy, the Stainless, the Blessed, Our Mother, Our Lady, Mother of God, and so on. So she's back. But Aleister Crowley said that for some reason best known to themselves, the translators of the Bible have carefully crowded out of existence and smothered up every reference to the fact that deity is both masculine and feminine. They have translated a feminine plural by masculine singular in the case of the word Elohim. So even though the word for God that was known throughout the whole of the world is feminine, we can just change that. We'll just masculinize it. Doesn't matter what anybody thinks. We're in business here. We've got the control of the human mind to think about. We don't care about the rules of grammar or language. He says that woman is equal to man. Okay, the great magician here is saying that woman is equal with man and certainly not inferior to him, as it has been persistent endeavor of so-called Christians to make her. That's right. In the magical tradition, such nonsense holds no currency. Erich Neumann, the German psychologist and historian, in his book The Great Mother says, although Christianity did its best to suppress it, this matriarchal symbolism has survived, and not only in the cup of the Last Supper or in the mythical Grail, the plunge bath became in Christianity the baptismal bath of transformation that is a return to the primordial egg of the beginning. Alvin Boyd Kuhn says, under the psychological influences of this persuasion, religion in this system was so overbalanced by the unmitigated overemphasis on the functional cult of the spirit and the corresponding militant negation of the physical and the natural, that Christian devotion was warped into forms of morbidity and corruption. The psychological consequences of this distortion became so patent in the history of the church that a rectification of the imbalance was perforce dictated by polity, and the Holy Mother was restored as the fourth member of the divine quaternity, as the Blessed Virgin or the Mother of God. Okay, so now God has a mother. The Son of the Mother thus became the Salvator Macrocosmi, the Savior of the world, by virtue of his uniting in himself the mundane, orthonic, unconscious lower potencies in polarity with the superior conscious divine powers. So Mary is reintroduced, and she's the mother of God. But right there, you have a problem, because many thousands of years before, the Egyptians had a mother of God. Nuth, Isis, Hathor, Mat, Tarut. Aleister Crowley, in his masterpiece, Magic and Theory and Practice, says that it is therefore incumbent upon the male magician to cultivate those female virtues in which he is deficient. It will then be lawful for a magician to invoke Isis and identify himself with her. If he fails to do this, his apprehension of the universe when he attains samadhi will lack the conception of maternity. The result will be a metaphysical and, by corollary, ethical limitation in the religion which he founds. Judaism and Islam are striking examples of this failure. Now, he's not endorsing the perverted types of things that people are getting into today. He's not talking about cross-dressing, transvestitism, or any of that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, and nor am I saying there's anything wrong with that if that's your means of getting in touch with the feminine. Hey, something's better than nothing, right? What I am saying is that those perversions are coming about because of the original suppression of the truth. If your mind and your heart and your soul is screaming for bipolarity, but we have no rites and rituals to help you to do that, then naturally your mind will find perverse ways of doing it. That's what the word perverse means. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that what's wrong is that you were suppressed in the first place. You were left in the dark and waylaid originally. But what the high magicians are talking about is more than that. They're talking about a systematic and reverent identification with the feminine principles, not in another, but in yourself, for whatever that might mean. And you can't know ahead of time what that will mean. For some, it'll be a little bit more. For some, it'll be a little bit less. For some, it'll be an intellectual process. For others, it may take on some sort of physical component. You don't know ahead of time. Nobody is there to teach you this or tell you this. It's purely your own. Now, if we turn to the Kabbalah, which is another one of the pages of the great Western magical tradition, and we turn to the Tree of Life and the fourfold nature of man, we have to clear up another piece of disinformation, and that is who originated the Kabbalistic system and the Tree of Life. Now, the Kabbalistic system is frequently touted to be the creation of the Hebrews. Though the Jews preserved the figure and philosophy of the Kabbalah, they are not its creators. Judeo-Christianity had a strict prohibition against graven images, remember. This prohibition is second in the Mosaic commandments and means that the Jews cannot lay claim to what is obviously an extremely elaborate symbolic treatise. The Kabbalah is again purely Egyptian in origin. As Helena Blavatsky says, according to Sir W. Jones and other Orientalists, the oldest discoverable languages of Persia are the Chaldaic and Sanskrit, and there is not a trace of Hebrew in these. It would be very surprising if there were, since the Hebrew known to the philologists does not date earlier than 500 BC, and its characters belong to a far later period still. What we know as the Hebrew language didn't fully come into effect and didn't get polished until the captivity in Babylon and then the sojourn in Greece. This is perfectly understood by scholars. When we look specifically at the Kabbalah, what is the Kabbalah? What is the Tree of Life? We find that it's a tree that has 10 zones, 10 circles, 10 regions of energy, and 22 intersecting paths. But most importantly is that the tree is divided horizontally into 4 levels or 4 regions, all corresponding to the elements. They have Hebrew names, Atziluth, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asaya, but they just represent fire, water, air, and earth. And the Kabbalah, the word alone tells you that it's Egyptian because the Egyptian had 3 parts of the soul. The Egyptians did not have one soul. The Egyptians had multiplicities of souls. When you have the dark part of you, and the happy part of you, and the light part of you, and the secret part of you, and the Errol Flynn type part of you, and all of these different aspects of yourself that you have, the fear part of you, we just think of those as parts of a single personality. You have a criminal part of you. You have a very spiritual side of you. You have a childlike side of you. All of these different sides of you. Well, they did not think of it as being all of these sides as of one central personality. They literally thought of that as separate souls into which your whole energy could pour. So theoretically, you could become manifested with that very, very childlike part of you permanently. It was your choice. But in their sacred tradition, the soul was of 3 levels. And those levels, believe it or not, were actually called the Ka, the Ba, and the Allah, or the La. So Kabbalah, the word, is actually Egyptian for the 3 parts of the soul. And the tree of life was often shown with a serpent coiling around it, and ancient scholars knew that Egypt was called the land of the tree and the serpent. The book of Genesis story, by the way, of the tree and the serpent is codified in Egypt. We know that the Kabbalah is Egyptian because those 10 zones I was talking about, in Hebrew, they're called Sephirah. Sephirah is where we get our word sphere from. They're just spheres of energy, realms of consciousness. Of course, this thing relates to the inner states, the inner psychological states. But each of the gods, and there were 11 in all, and there was an Ennead. The Egyptians had their famous Ennead, which is 9 gods. So of the 9, 10, 11 major deities, there's one for each of the zones on the tree of life. And originally, these deities were perfectly assigned to the tree of life. Those 4 regions on the tree of life have correspondences to the tarot cards. The wands, the cups, the swords, and the discs are the 4 zones: fire, water, air, and earth. In the tarot cards, just like in regular playing cards, the deck is divided into 4 suits called the wands, the cups, the swords, and the discs. The wands is like your clubs, the cups is hearts, the swords relates to the spades, and the discs would be the diamonds in regular playing cards. But in esoteric tradition, they go along with the Kabbalistic 4 realms. Now, Jesus dying on the cross of 4, above his head, we often see this term INRI, INRI, and it's put before us that means the King of the Jews. But nobody really has a decent translation of it, and the biblical concordances and biblical dictionaries say that the jury's out, they don't know really what it means. Well, again, it's not that hard to decipher. The INRI are well known in the occult tradition. Those are the 4 letters representing the 4 elements: fire, water, air, and earth. And it's the same in Latin or in Hebrew. If you fire, water, air, and earth in Latin or Hebrew, the letters are INRI at the beginning of the words. So Jesus is now dying to what? To the 4 elements. He's transcending the 4. Now, Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky says that the crucifix, as we know it, the crucifix of Jesus, was an instrument of torture and utterly common among Romans, as it was unknown among Semitic nations. It is certainly not the Christian cross that John had in mind when speaking of the signet of the living God. So she's refuting the idea that the crucifix is not the cross. Okay, when the Christian fathers were talking about the cross as the symbol of Christianity, it was not to the crucifix that they were originally referring. Interestingly, when we go back to the very first dynasty of the first cult of Egypt, the very first god, that's the first god of the first dynasty of Egypt, his name is Atum, A-T-U-M. But in numerology, those letters are 1, 2, 3, and 4. The androgynous Atum was personified by the pharaoh who is seated on the cubic throne with arms crossed in a quaternity. Jesus hangs on the cross in a quaternity. Pharaoh sits on the cube with his hands crossed in front of him like this. So whether your arms are like this as a 4-fold entity, or whether they're like that as a 4-fold entity, the mythos is the same. The symbolic message is the same. You are a quaternity. You are a 4-fold individual. Now, Atum, A-T-U-M, is the same thing as the Hindu Atman, or the soul, but the Jews picked up on this, the Hebrews, and they made it Atum, or Adum, or Adam. And the word Adam in numerology is 1414, which also makes 10. So Atum, 1, 2, 3, and 4, of course, if you add the digits 1, 2, 3, and 4, it makes 10. So Atum, the first god of the first dynasty of Egypt, is completion. He's total man, number 10. 10 has always been a symbol for completion, Adam, Kadmon. Adam is 1414, slightly different numerology, but in fact, it also equals 10. And you can always remember that because that's how your hands are. A thumb and 4 fingers, a thumb and 4 fingers, 1, 4, 1, 4 is Adam, man. So when you see the Christ on the cross, or with the cross as a symbol beside him or behind him, and you see the Pharaoh with his arms crossed in front of him, please understand that it's the same story that is being told. The story of the enlightened, androgynous, saintly man who is on the path of self-realization, who's transcending the 4, the limitations of the 4. Same thing in India. Same thing in India, when you have the one man with 4 arms. Same thing when you have the geometry of the 4 points of the mandalas. Same idea in the ancient Vedic swastika, which originally also had to do with this. of polarities coming together, magnetic polarities coming together. Same idea in the tree of life, originally an Egyptian motif that shows you 4 striations, 4 levels, a tree with 4 divisions. In the tarot, this is one of the most important of all motifs. As I show in my classes on the tarot, this quartering motif is hidden or secreted into the imagery. You often see many of the figures in positions that demarcate the triangle and especially the squaring or the quartering. So we don't have time in this program to go into all the meanings of it, but just for now, notice that there on the left in the center of the high priestess's chest, you have the cross. In the Wheel of Fortune, there's the cross, and there's the 4 evangelist symbols on the corners of the card. And on the right-hand side, again, Lady Universe is dancing in what they call the dance of Shiva, with her leg crossed at the knee point. Why is this imagery there? And also she, on that card, has the 4 symbols of the compass points around her. And in the Emperor card, we also see that figure. To what is this referring? Here again, on the card for Sagittarius, number 14, we have a square in the middle and the triangle. In Judgment, card number 20, we have the square. You only have to look at the Christian art, and you'll see the quartering motif, the square being used a lot. Here in Celtic mythology, here's the saint in the middle, and on either side of him, you have the square of the cross. We just think it's all artwork and never paid any attention. In Egypt, we have the idea of Horus, yes, the sun god, but he has 4 suns. And those 4 suns are well known to represent the 4 corners. But could they also not represent the 4 aspects of human consciousness? The 4 types? The Kabbalah tree of life, as we said, was divided into 4. And then those 10 circles of energy were arranged from that point on. This was a mystery that was kept in Egypt, the land of the tree and the serpent. Sometimes we'll even see the serpent itself with 4 undulations. Now, before we leave the Kabbalah, there's another interesting thing to bring out about it. I didn't mention the 3 bars or the 3 paths. If you actually look at the Kabbalistic tree of life, you'll notice that it's also made up of 3 vertical poles, one on the left, one in the middle, and one on the right. These 3 staffs or poles or ascents are very interesting as well, especially the one in the middle, which is called the pillar of equilibrium. In Kabbalah, if you study this and get a book on Kabbalah and look at the tarot cards that are associated with the central pillar on the tree of life. Okay, so if you've never been into the subject before, just go and browse a book on the Kabbalah. You can get books on it. And tarot cards are assigned to those 22 paths. But if you look at all the cards of the central path, which is known as the pillar of equilibrium, the pillar of balance, every single card is a feminine card. So the straight road from ignorance to enlightenment, from earth to heaven, the straight road has only feminine tarot cards associated with it. Because she was a keeper of the mysteries. In card number 2, we even see the Kabbalah symbol, but in a different type of design. The high priestess sitting between the 2 pillars, but she is literally the middle pillar. And behind her is the pomegranate tree. The pomegranate tree was sacred to Persephone, the goddess of the underworld. The idea being that you're going to have to go into the underworld and through the unconscious in order to be enlightened. You must pass through your own shadow, and then you come to the tree of everlasting knowledge. The fruit of the tree of life is hidden behind the female principle, the Sophic principle. That was also known as the path of the arrow. But the path of the serpent is also a term that is given to the tree of life. And of course, we understand that the serpent and the female are connected in the program Astrotheology. We even saw that in Egypt, when you wanted to write the word woman, you drew a serpent. The hieroglyphic serpent indicated the female. Joseph Campbell says that Jane Ellen Harrison, the historian, demonstrated over half a century ago that the field festivals and mystery cults of Greece, numerous vestiges survived of a pre-Homeric mythology in which the place of honor was held not by the male gods of the sunny Olympic pantheon, but by a goddess, darkly ominous, who might appear as 1, 2, 3, or many, and was the mother of both the living and the dead. And her consort was typically in serpent form. Any of you who've read my book on Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, will know much more about the relationship between the female and the serpent. Now, Joseph Campbell in Occidental Mythology says that in Eve's scene at the tree, nothing is said to indicate that the serpent who appeared and spoke to her was a deity in his own right, who had been revered in the Levant, or the Middle East, for at least 7,000 years before the composition of the book of Genesis. Of course, many Christians have asked, where did this serpent first appear? How does he just happen to turn up? And who's this Lilith who just, happens to turn up? Why is there vague histories about all of this? Well, as Joseph Campbell is saying here, it's all much more ancient. It comes from ages past. Ariel Gutman and Kenneth Johnson in their book Mythic Astrology say, in the Near East, the primordial serpent is described as feminine. And we may suspect that in this region, the myth did indeed become a metaphor for the conquest of matriarchy. But its universality suggests that there is yet a deeper psycho-spiritual meaning behind it. Gerald Massey in Egypt, the Light of the World, says, the Hebrews follow the Babylonians in confusing the uraeus serpent with the serpent of death. He says the retouching by the Greeks, like that of the Semites, tended to efface the figures or falsify the meaning of the mythos, and the astronomical facts are of 1,000-fold more important than all the petty embellishments of irresponsible fancy. But perhaps the worst perversion of the true mythos made by the Greeks was in their treatment of the polar dragon. So he's obviously showing us that not only was there a denigration of the female in later times, but almost running concurrently with that was the denigration, misinterpretation, and hybridization of the serpent symbol. Now we understand that these are not disconnected, because they were very connected in ancient times. The female and the serpent were twin motifs. You can't mess with one without the other. And always, even later days though, as much as the corruption was taking place, you still see the idea of the female being connected to the tree of life. Here we have Persephone with the pomegranate, but that's an ancient symbol going way back. In Egypt, the female is always associated with the tree of life. Nuth, of course, was the tree of life, not associated with it. She was the tree of life. That's where we get our English word nut. When nuts are given from the trees, it's also the idea of the ovums of the female, the goddess Nuth. Proverbs 3 appears to be talking about Mary, but is actually, of course, talking about something much more primal than that. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things thou canst desire are not to be compared unto her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her, and happy is everyone that retaineth her. Wow, these are terms that you would think would be reserved for God or for Jesus, but here we've got all the goods in the hands of the goddess, the tree of life in the Bible. So it's not a heavy piece of information that the fruit, the forbidden fruit, might involve the female rights. We talked about the Jed pillar and the tree of life in Egypt, which was known as the Jed. And the Jedi, or the Jed, was the phallus of Osiris that needed to be replaced, but it was also considered the Kundalini, the energy of the natural energy of the body, which is also to be raised. Later on, as the Christians got hold of that idea of the tree of life, that had to be made now into the tree of good and evil. Again, the idea of splitting, the idea of creating duality. But we always see that the tree plays a central part in the Garden of Olives, or in the baptism scene, or the tree of Golgotha, in which Christ is crucified. And the Hindus had their tree of life as well. It's a primordial motif. The Scandinavians have their Yggdrasil. And we talked also about that if you have 4, you must have 5, because in transcending 4, you then represent yourself as the 5th element, which was known in Greek as epsilon, that's their 5th letter, sacred letter E, or the quintessence, the 5th essence. This is an important aspect. It's basically the same thing as the chemical wedding. And the symbol of that, or the mastery of the symbol of that, was the pentagram. That's why you'll often see the magician standing in his circle with the pentagram, or the magician will wear the symbol of the pentagram. This is nothing evil about it. The pentagram originally was associated with the 5 letters of the word hygiene, to represent those who have a pure mind or pure consciousness. And in the ceremonies of the 5th element, you would want to meditate on a 5-fold solid or a 5-fold image in order to reach that state. But one of the other most interesting and common symbols of the 5th essence was the dragon. The dragon whose claws gripped the earth, whose scales were like the fish in the sea, whose wings beat the air, the element air, and who breathed the fire, was nothing more than an image representing the unification of the 4. And those who could slay the dragon or ride the dragon, or who were permitted to speak to the dragon, were those who had again achieved that state of quintessence, the 5th element. So the slaying of the dragon and the releasing of the feminine were also connected, as you see here in the famous painting by Paolo Uccello. The idea being that slaying the dragon, and the dragon is passive here, peaceful. It's not an attacking dragon, it's just something that needs to be overcome, and overcome in the right way. Man goes through the labyrinth, which is his own consciousness, destroys the dragon there, and releases the feminine, or bonds with the feminine that is always chained. Because the dragon, when the dragon is unawakened, then it's the reptilian limbic side of ourselves. But as the alchemists knew, gold is not just created with a wave of a magic wand. Gold is created out of the lead, out of the negredo, out of the calcinatio state. So that which is lead becomes something higher, is transmuted in the same way that carbon becomes a diamond. So in the same way, as Lucifer fell, so he must rise again. If Lucifer falls by a lightning flash, then it is as a lightning flash that the Son of God goes home. This was a very important point. Jacob's ladder. The angels and the demons go up and down. So if the dragon that is the dragon of enlightenment, there must be a corresponding dragon of darkness or dragon of illusion. The pharaohs who wore the symbol of the serpent and the dragon on their forehead, as we said, the word literally meant enlightened mind. Those were those who had transmuted the dragon, who had ridden the dragon, who had conquered the mysteries. They were the members of the serpent cult who understood and kept this mystery from antiquity. The modern Judeo-Christian Vatican hegemony are those who hide it, sequester it, take it away from us, keep us in confusion, ruled by the lower dragon. And the last of, but not least of the great chapters of the Book of Symbolism and the Book of the Magical Western Tradition is the subject of numerology, which often, as the word implies, involves numbers, the science of number. But Carl Jung says that numbers are not concepts consciously invented by men for purposes of calculation. They are spontaneous and autonomous products of the unconscious, as are other archetypal symbols. Marie-Louise von Franz, who is a very close associate of Carl Jung, in her book The Process of Individuation, says that numbers thus appear to be a tangible connection between the spheres of matter and psyche. What they're talking about might be difficult for us to understand until we realize that we didn't invent numbers. You don't invent the numbers 1 to 9. Those numbers just exist because they themselves are repositories of higher symbolic energies, something that's very elusive, rarefied, abstract, manifests itself down, and we understand it from this level as being the numbers. The numbers represent elements that are much more numinous. They're just concentrates and all sorts of occult principles associated with them. Again, numerology is a very vast and interesting subject, but we can condense it quite a bit when we understand that central to the subject of numerology are the 3 kinds of time. There is, of course, clock time, which we're all familiar with. There is calendrical time, with which we're all familiar, the idea of the seasons and the 12 seasons that we pass through, the 4 seasons, but the 12 signs of the zodiac or the 12 months of the year. And then there's the third, which is much, much less known, and that is psychological time. Psychological time. Now, the first 2, we're veritable slaves of. We should be in absolutely no doubt that they exist. I mean, the watch on your hand has the 12 divisions. The calendar on your wall of the year has the 12 months of the year. But then we have psychological time. What's the clock to measure that? Well, the clock for measuring psychological time was nothing more than the zodiac. That's what the zodiac is. It is a clock for measuring psychological time. There's nothing mysterious about it. There's no hocus pocus. It is simply to be used, and the doctor would use a thermometer to take your temperature. Nothing more mysterious than that, unless somebody is willfully using divination to be malign. And there's no doubt that there are such people who do that. 12 months, 12 hours, 12 signs. Numerology is the art that specifically deals in how to get you in touch with your psychological time clock and your psychological rhythms. Because there's also a very important map, a time map, what we call the personal timeline, that can assist you in becoming empowered in your daily life. And if you're out of touch with it, well, it's just like casting off your physical watch and saying, hey, I can live without my date book, I can live without my calendar, I can live without my watch for 2.5 weeks. See what chaos your physical life will be in trying to handle that scenario. Just do it, test it, see if you can do it even for a few days. Well, think of the consequences then when you've taken away your inner clock, as we've all done, and cast it away. Think of the consequences to the soul, afloat on the ocean of karma and time and space. When we look at the number 1, for instance, we find that this has an origin. 1, we saw in astrotheology that the word on meant light in Egyptian, and 1 means the light. Of course, all number must come from the light or come from 1. But 1 also derives from the Vedic word yoni, or onai. And yoni is always known to be the symbol of the female regenerative power. So 1 literally is the birth of all other number, but it refers to the female. In astrology, the symbol for the sun, and the sun is always considered very masculine, of course, in astrology, it's the male symbol. But let's look at the symbol again. The symbol for the sun is this symbol. It's traditionally connected with masculinity and dominance. The traditional symbol of the sun is a circle with a point in it. However, it is of single interest that this is also the image of the female breast. We'll often see the sun god or the sun king Horus or Krishna sitting in the head of a bull, or he'll have the bull's headdress. Many times in Egypt, you see the god standing on the top of the bull's head when you'll see the horns. However, what this relates to is, again, much more biological in nature. The ancients understood that the shape of a bull's face and the horns represented the fallopian tube complex of the uterus and the female generative opening, from which comes what? The child, the birth of a child. In fact, when they see the child or the sun, you'll often see even the sun disk in the middle of the horns of a cow or a bull. Same thing, the idea of giving birth. Birth comes from the fallopian complex of the female, and that seemed to look like, physically to them, the head and the horns of a bull. And the twisting process that is, they said, experienced subconsciously by the child as it makes its way out of the canal, the birth canals, That was the reason why labyrinths were often drawn in ancient times, and even why the Celts spent so much time with these interweaving zoomorphic shapes and with the little heads at the end. They'd have little human faces or heads at the end of these entwining labyrinthine drawings of theirs to represent this movement through the female. It's today the same reason why they say when you walk through a labyrinth, these earthwork labyrinths that they have made, if you walk on them, you have this uncanny sense of peace. Well, yes, because it's reminding you of something very peaceful and something very primal. In mythology and in religion, we have the motif of the two mothers of God, or the two Marys. Leonardo da Vinci was fascinated by that. We'll always see the two females at the foot of the cross. The two Marys, Martha and Miriam, Mary the mother of God, Mary Magdalene. We've got in the Old Testament Eve and Lilith. In Greek mythology, we've got Demeter and Persephone. There's many, many examples of this. But again, the original duad is the sisters, the twin sisters in Egypt, Isis and Nephthys. There you see them standing behind the pharaoh. In astrotheology, we always talk about how the male was an officiator or an ambassador or an agent for the feminine principle. That feminine principle is the feather of Mat that's above his head. He officiates for Mat. That means he's in perfect harmony and balance. He has the four suns in front of him. And then behind him stand the two goddesses who represent the two phases of the moon, the crescent moon. But they are known as Isis and Nephthys. There they are again, always behind the sun god, presiding over the events. And the headdress of Isis is a seat, S-E-A-T. She is the goddess of the east. And her sister Nephthys, who represented the dark present, was the goddess of the home and the hearth, but her headdress was of the tower. And now these sisters, as a duad, are known as the Reti. Eric Newman speaks of them in his book, Origin and Evolution of Consciousness. He said, the fact that the hero has two fathers or two mothers is a central feature in the canon of the hero myth. An archetypal mother figure appears beside the personal mother. So an archetypal mother and the stereotypical mother. The archetypal father and the stereotypical father. King Arthur is born of Uther, Pendragon, but he's taken by Merlin, and then he's given into the hands of Sir Kay, his twin, and into one of the other knights for safekeeping. Uriens or whoever, I can't remember right now, but he's raised by another knight. All the mythological heroes have two fathers or two mothers. Just understand where these principles come from. We move to the concept of threeness. Threeness is one of the most important archetypes. One important threefold division is our sense of time. We have past and present and future. Another concerns the three gunas, which give rise in humans to the various personality dispositions. The High Celts used the symbol of the triskelion, or three spirals, to represent the three main glands in the brain. Of the tower. And now these sisters, as a duad, are known as the Reti. Eric Newman speaks of them in his book, Origin and Evolution of Consciousness. He said, the fact that the hero has two fathers or two mothers is a central feature in the canon of the hero myth. An archetypal mother figure appears beside the personal mother. So an archetypal mother and the stereotypical mother. The archetypal father and the stereotypical father. King Arthur is born of Uther, Pendragon, but he's taken by Merlin, and then he's given into the hands of Sir Kay, his twin, and into one of the other knights for safekeeping. Uriens or whoever, I can't remember right now, but he's raised by another knight. All the mythological heroes have two fathers or two mothers. Just understand where these principles come from. We move to the concept of threeness. Threeness is one of the most important archetypes. One important threefold division is our sense of time. We have past and present and future. Another concerns the three gunas, which give rise in humans to the various personality dispositions. The High Celts used the symbol of the triskelion, or three spirals, to represent the three main glands in the brain, the pineal, the pituitary, and the hypothalamus, which they believe controlled all other glands, hormones, and organs. Geometry. This triangle is one of the most important geometrical symbols in architecture and also in nature, the way things grow and the way things are designed and built. We even have whole cities designed based on the triangle. We haven't got time in this program to do an entire analysis of all the numbers associated with the goddess. You're dealing with thousands of years of mythology, and numbers like number 9 alone, just the study of the number 9 in relationship to the goddess, let alone 3 and the prime numbers and the triad numbers, would be a monumental task. Now, coming to the way of the goddess, we find that the ancients had several ways of personifying the goddess. The first emanation of the goddess's power was the female the physical female herself, obviously. Her body was in harmony with the movement of the celestial orbs. As Oswald Spengler, the historian, says, the reproduction of the species is feminine. It runs steadily and quietly through all species, animal or human, through all short-lived cultures. It is primary, unchanging, everlasting, maternal, plant-like, and cultureless. If we look back, we find that it is synonymous with life itself. So Spengler is talking about the direct relationship between life itself and the female. Upaleus in his Golden Ass says, I am nature, the universal mother, mistress of all the elements, primordial child of time, sovereign of all things spiritual, queen of the dead, queen also of the immortals, the single manifestation of all gods and goddesses that are. I want you to please note for now just this term queen of the dead. We're going to try to explain a little bit later what that means in relation to spiritual development, that there's two paths to spiritual development, and that the West has got out of sync because they only understand one phase of development, one mode of operation when it comes to spiritual development. J.J. Bakofen, one of the greatest scholars on the subject of the matriarchal cults of antiquity, says that woman exists everlasting, self-subsistent, immutable. Man, evolving, is subject to continual decay. In the realm of the physical, therefore, the masculine principle is of second rank, subordinate to the feminine. The earth being bountiful and resplendent was also seen as a perfect symbol for the goddess. So we have the ordinary physical female being a representative for the goddess. The next symbol of power that the ancients give was the earth itself. It was green, it was bountiful, it seemed to be eternal, and it was providing all your needs. George Russell, the Irish philosopher and member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, said that I believe that most of what was said of God was in reality said of that spirit, whose body is earth. And Jane Ellison Harrison says, a worship of the powers of fertility, which includes all plant and animal life, is broad enough to be sound and healthy. But as man's attention centers more and more on his own humanity, such a worship is an obvious source of danger and disease. So she's not saying that focusing on humanity is a wrong thing. Again, it's all about balance. If you do it to the exception of focusing on the natural, then it becomes something that can be distorted. In the tarot cards, we often see the nature of the goddess in her connection to the elements, also in her connection to the serpent. J.J. Bakofen in Das Mütternacht, his book on the matriarchal cult, says the prime datum is the earth, the basic maternal substance. Visible creation proceeds from her womb, and is only then that the sexes become divided into two. Only then does the masculine come into being. Thus the male and female do not appear simultaneously. They are not of the same order. The female is primary, the male is only what comes out of her. And thirdly, the goddess was symbolized by the night sky. It was considered her womb, the theater of the mysteries. In fact, it was considered probably the most important of the symbols of the female was the night sky because of all the phenomena that actually happens up there. According to Barbara Walker in her Women's Encyclopedia of Myth and Legend, she was the world body, the primal abyss from which the sun first rose. She was the spirit behind the veil, whom no mortal could see face to face. An ocean infinite in extent and of fathomless depth, bearing the germ of all kinds of life. That's right, Nuth, the goddess of the night. All the stars and the planets were merely embryos or spermatozoon in her great womb. The Latin writer Plutarch, in a translation of an Egyptian passage on the goddess Neith, said, I am all that has been and is and shall ever be, and my robe no mortal has yet uncovered. Lao Tzu, the Chinese Taoist, in his Tao Te Ching said, there was something formless yet complete, that existed before heaven and earth, without sound, without substance, dependent on nothing, unchanging, all-pervading, unfailing. One may think of it as the mother of all things under heaven. In Occidental mythology, Joseph Campbell writes, in the Neolithic village, the central figure of all mythology and worship was the bountiful goddess Earth, as the mother and nourisher of life and receiver of the dead for rebirth. However, in the temples even of the first of the higher civilizations, the great goddess of highest concern was certainly much more than that. She was already, as she is now in the Orient, a metaphysical symbol, the arch personification of the power of space, time, and matter, within whose bounds all beings arise and die, the substance of their bodies, configurator of their lives and thoughts, the receiver of their dead, and everything having form or name, including God, personified as good or evil, merciful or wrathful, was her child within her womb. Aleister Crowley underscores what Campbell is saying here in a passage. He quotes the quote is, the female is to be regarded as having been separated from the male in order to reproduce the male in a superior form. Again, one of the ancient passages from the ancient world, from Egypt. Isis in her own words, I am she that is the natural mother of all things, mistress and governess of all the elements, the initial progeny of worlds, chief of the powers divine, queen of all that are in hell, the original principle of them that dwell in heaven, manifested alone and under one form of all the gods and goddesses. At my will the planets of the sky, the wholesome minds, sea, and the lamentable silence of hell are disposed. My divinity is adored throughout the world in divers manners, in variable customs and by many names. And the Egyptians, which are excellent in all kinds of ancient doctrine, and by their proper ceremonies accustomed to worship me, do call me by my true name, Queen Isis. From the most ancient of days, we have the Venusian goddess and the concept of the mother. And through the art of the world, the tremendous emphasis of the female form and also the mysteries of the feminine, both in the sacred and profane way. Plato in his Timaeus says, she presides over the whole of generation into natural existence, leads forth into light all natural reasons, and extends a prolific power from on high, even to the subterranean realms. I want to mention again that there's a lot of emphasis here on hell and the subterranean realm, the underworld. We'll be coming more to what that really means later on. Eric Newman says the archetypal feminine is not only a giver and protector of life, but as a container also holds fast and takes back. She is the goddess of life and death at once. The feminine contains opposites, and the world actually lives because it combines earth and heaven, night and day, death and life. The vessel character of the feminine not only shelters the unborn, but also takes back the dead into the vessel of death, the cave or coffin, the tomb or urn. We said earlier about how important that was to the ancient Celts and to the Egyptians to inter their dead warriors or kings into the tomb or the mound that literally embodied the body of the goddess. In the Shakti Sangama Tantra, we read that woman is the creator of the universe is her form. Woman is the foundation of the world. She is the true form of the body. In woman is the form of all things, of all that lives and moves in the world. There is no jewel rarer than woman, no condition superior to that of woman. Now, we need to understand that not a lot of women are aware of this issue also. Just like men are a travesty of what masculinity represents, so many women have fallen from what these ancient texts are saying. We have a problem in the world. Neither being is manifesting what they really could be, far from it. There's an initiation and an evolution required on both fronts here. As D. Hollander in his Tarot for Beginnings says, the high priestess uses her wisdom and understanding to enable others to find their own true path. The high priest uses his power to increase his authority over others. Of course, a lot of the problems started from Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, and from the book of Genesis. From the outset of the Bible, we have the denigration of the female and, as we're saying here, of the feminine. The book of Genesis and the temptation of Eve. Now, we find that the book of Genesis was originally known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is also called the Book of Coming Forth by Day. But that book also went by the name of the Book of Gen Isis. And the word Gen meant queen or woman. It's a word that meaning the genes or generation of Isis. From the same root, we have so many words. Gen, Gen, means woman or queen in Anglo-Saxon, which gives Jen or Gwen, the girl's name Gwen, or Quinn or Queen, or Gwyn or Gwen in Welsh. We also get Gwen-Avir, meaning the white or fair woman or white queen. And of course, we understand that Guinevere is nothing more than a rescripting of the white queen of Egypt, Isis, with Arthur being a rescripting of Osiris. Jinn, G-I-N, comes from it also, as done Gyn, Genes, Genius, Genie, the woman's name Jean, the term gentle, generosity, and gain. These are all terms that originate from that. In fact, when you said that this child is a real genius, what you were actually talking about was, yes, because it's the female genes that have passed on to him, because the word genes, by the way, means the female. Alvin Boyd Kuhn says that it is quite exciting, incidentally, to know that the Genesis account of the creation of mankind through its first parentage in Adam and Eve bears the marks of derivation from the primary Egyptian symbolic depiction. Yes, because now at least we may have the chance of finding out the true meaning of the story and setting the problem to right. In Egypt, we have the primal parents. Adam and Eve is an old story. The original Adam and Eve were actually called Jeb and Nut. Jeb is the earth god, and Nut is the sky goddess, his consort. Now, the 16th card of the tarot is called the tower struck with lightning. It has several meanings, but its imagery has also to do with the act of conception, which fascinated the ancients. And that's right, the tower struck with lightning has many symbolism attached to it, but the idea of a phallic tower with the top of it blasting off was always understood as a symbol for orgasm and a symbol for conception on a deeper level. The Egyptians, of course, the designers of the tarot, are not people who are just interested in genital sexuality. These individuals understood the mystery of conception. And what a mystery it is. They thought to themselves, wow, what is this mysterious thing that with a lightning flash of spiritual energy, something happens, and within the body of a female, from an ovum comes a human form, comes a spiritual life. in the cauldron that they knew as the womb of the mother. They thought this was unbelievable, how this incredible magical act took place. They understood that Nut is the tree of life, and in her womb are the ovums. And the ovums were always known in ancient times, though, as the apples. So in the book of Genesis story, when you read about the apple from the tree of life, we've already established that the tree of life is the ancient goddess. Well, then what are the fruits of the tree of life? Those are the ovum. But what's the fruit from the real tree of life? Is the apples. So when you read in the book of Genesis about temptation involving an apple, just understand that we have a story here that is based in the old tantric alchemist androgynous concept. Ovum are apples. And the serpent that comes in to bite the apple, or who tempts somebody to bite the apple, was always known in ancient times as a representation of the male sperm, the spermatozoon, which we know today under a microscope looks like a little wriggling serpent or a little wriggling snake. Well, you know, the whole question of how the ancients were able to see that and know that, I go into in my book on Atlantis, which deals in just how incredibly technically advanced the ancients were. But from purposes of this show, let's just keep it simple. The idea that the ovum was the apple that is bitten into slowly, gradually, by the sperm. That's why the head becomes bruised. And as the modern biologists know today, that when the sperm enters into the ova, the circle of the ova, when the sperm enters in, its head breaks off, or the tail snaps away. And in the tower struck with lightning, that's exactly what you see. The tower's head is being blasted off. Now, this story, the original story of Genesis, comes, of course, from the old Palmyrians, the mystery school tradition in Egypt, where the tree of life and these mysteries were all taught in their original form. Here's a hieroglyphic that encapsulates what we're talking about here. You see the goddess, Eve, with the ova, with the apple, offering this mystery, this our secret mystery, to the male. Above them is the serpent and the ova. Above their head, you see the cobra. In Egypt, this was a common symbol, always showing the circle and the cobra, or the sperm and the ovum, the apple. But there's no concept of evil involving in any of this at the time of the stellar cult. So here we see an act of initiation. The recumbent male, who's in a state of torpor, is being initiated by the female priestess, who represents the earth. On the right, you see the tree of life, which is again fourfold. And you see the rapport, the interaction, that the male will gain his regency, his sovereignty, his kingship. He sits on the chair of the panther god. The panther, of course, represents enlightenment, the cult of the priests. So the whole actual scene is so much more languid and poetic and beautiful than the Christians' mythographers turned it into. Genes, as we said, from the word for woman, same as genius, implies the female muse. The serpent, or the spirit, and imagination were always originally personified by female archetypes. The high priestess was the initiator of the great mysteries of old. And the second card of the tarot lets us know that, because it's the high priestess. Behind her is the tree of life, the half-cut pomegranates, which represent the seeds of the ovum, the keeper of the mysteries. So biting the apple is a euphemism for the male sperm entering the ova. That's one of the reasons why bad children were referred to as rotten apples. And our letter Q, which is a round circle with a straight line, or sometimes a squiggly line going into the Q, also was a representation of that act. Of course, this act has magical properties that we're completely unaware of now. It's all a matter of biology and nothing too much to think about. We have no real understanding of the miracle of conception whatsoever, because everything has been trashed, everything's been perverted, everything's been dumbed down to a most mundane, degree. We're not infused anymore with the miracle of masculine and feminine and all that this implies. The alchemists knew this mystery and they called it Azoth. Azoth was mercury, the secret elixir. It's one of the reasons why AZT is also given as an elixir to cure AIDS. AZT is a very ancient term coming out of Egypt, which meant the elixir of life, the liquid of all life. But the symbol for it was a serpent and an egg, or a serpent surrounding a globe. Here you have the serpent and the globe. So every time you now see the cobra and the globe, you'll know what it means. So now we know what was. How did that change, and how do we get what we've got? It has to do with the rise of the solar cult. The rise of the solar cult. In the program in this series called Astrotheology and Sidereal Mythology, we go into the 4 cults. In fact, we go into the 7 cults, but the 4 of greatest power, and show how their power dynamics operated in the ancient world, how one supplanted the other, how they appropriated the mythologies, and how after a long period of time, they all decided to join together, become the first conglomerate, setting about the control of not only trade routes, but the domination of the human mind. And how many of the royal families, royal dynasties, even media personalities are all descended from these cults of power, are bloodline connected to them, and have an agenda that they're working on, an agenda we need to rapidly find out about, because we're actually participating in it in an unconscious way. But briefly, we can sketch it out here again. Raina Thunk, editor of Love, Sex, and Matriarchy, that's the book by Eric Fromm, says that we will never understand the psychology of either women or men as long as we fail to acknowledge that a state of war has existed between the sexes for approximately 6,000 years. 6,000 years ago, patriarchy triumphed over women, and society became organized on the basis of male domination. Women became the property of men and were obliged to be grateful to them for every concession. And I hope by now you take our point that we're trying to prove here that this is not a war that just happened to organically take place. This is not something that just happened willy-nilly one day. This is part of an orchestrated by design concept. Leonard Shlain says that we look back across the historical time of patriarchy, there seems to be some terrible inevitability, a relentless desire to crush the female essence. The question of why is one of the most puzzling of our time. These mainstream authors, even though they know the problem, are very hesitant to go the extra step and say, well, okay, this was by design and this was, a machination, and we can study that machination and do something about it. They resist that, and being purely intellectual, they'll just state the problem mostly and not go the extra distance to really remedy the problem. But we are in the 21st century now. The new paradigm is in town, solution thing. And that might be uncomfortable in certain areas because we have to realize that there's been a campaign against the mind and the libido of the human being for many thousands of years. We don't just get into these problems overnight. Aleister Crowley, the Victorian magician, said that for some reason best known to themselves, the translators of the Bible have carefully crowded out of existence and smothered up every reference to the fact that deity is both masculine and feminine. They have translated a feminine plural by masculine singular in the case of the word Elohim. Now, phallocentricity is endorsed and reinforced not only in secular society, but by almost all Orthodox religions and institutions that clearly seem more interested in politics and separation than in spirituality and integration. Christians would do well to ask themselves whether the loving Jesus would really have chastised Mary, saying that he came only from the Father and recognized no mother. One of the main fallacies of Occidental religions is that which espouses that man begins as a sinner and gets to the light by means of conversion involving any number of physical intermediaries. To the Gnostics and Sophics, this philosophy holds no currency. The Gnostics did not convert sinners, they awoken the ready. As Swala de Lubitsch, the great Egyptologist, said, the priesthood is always and will be always abusive. Now, Eric Fromm says the document that most powerfully exemplifies an extremely male patriarchal attitude is the Old Testament. It is not surprising that the subject of productiveness, the creation itself, also finds an extreme male solution in its pages. The reason why the Old Testament exhibits such a one-sided male character is that as the primary text of Jewish monotheism, it represents a male victory over female deities, over the matriarchal remnants in the social structures. The Old Testament is the triumphal hymn of the victorious male religion, a song of victory commemorating the destruction of all traces of the matriarchy in religion and society. Don't believe it? All you got to do is read it. Isaiah 1 says, bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with them. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hateth. They are trouble unto me. I am weary to bear them. Come now and let us reason together, saith the Lord. In the Laws of Manu, which is an 8th century Vedic text, though destitute of virtue, or seeking pleasure elsewhere, or devoid of good qualities, a husband must be constantly worshipped as a god by a faithful wife. If a wife obeys her husband, she will for that reason alone be exalted in heaven. But of course, we understand that the role of the female, the whole issue, goes back to masculine and feminine, yes, but it also goes back to the difference between being and doing. The mysteries of being were meant to be taught to man, or were meant to be kept by the feminine or the female, whereas man was more of the doer, or the masculine proclivity within us is more the doer and the accomplisher. But there's also another ground of being, and that is being, which does not imply doing. Now, women were meant to be the keepers of this mystery. Being is connected to life and to space and to the feminine principle, whereas doing is more about lifestyle, time, and is also of the masculine modality. The loss of our ability to just be and our inflation of the ability to do has caused a lot of the world's problems. Eric Fromm says the detailed description of life of primitive hunters and food gatherers has shown that man, at least since he fully emerged 50,000 years ago, was most likely not the brutal, destructive, cruel being, and hence not the prototype of man the killer that we find in more developed stages of his evolution. So he's saying that the primitive man was more in connection with his being. He was a doer also, but he was in balance. He understood the mystery of being. And as a result, he was less violent and less troubled existentially. Marshall Solins says the world's most primitive people have few possessions, but they are not poor. Poverty is not a certain amount of goods, nor is it just a relation between means and ends. Above all, it is a relation between people. Poverty is a social status. As such, it is the invention of civilization. Leonard Shlain says, there were no religious wars in the ancient world before monotheism. Isn't that a heavy piece of information? So just in case you're interested in tracking the history of war and how that remarkable phenomena of our world comes about, just realize that it has a birthday, monotheism. Leonard Shlain in Sex, Time and Power says, culture is man's defense against nature. David Watson in his Pathology of Civilization says, primal society had been called the original affluent society. Affluent because its needs are few. All its desires are easily met. Its toolkit is elegant and lightweight. Its outlook linguistically complex and conceptually profound, yet simple and accessible to all. Its culture is expansive and ecstatic. It is property-less and communal, egalitarian and cooperative. Like nature, it is essentially leaderless, neither patriarchal or matriarchal. It is anarchic, which is to say that no archon, no ruler, has built or occupied center stage. It is rather an organic constellation of persons, each unique. Primal society maintained its equilibrium and its egalitarianism because it refused power, refused property. Understood? He is emphasizing what we were talking about earlier on, that yes, of course, man had his duty to perform socially, but the whole thrust of ancient society was on the independent self. This has been blurred and obscured today. Man didn't want power. He refused it openly because it was a poison. He understood it to be the very thing that would stand in the way of him developing personally. Socrates said, to harm another is to harm oneself. He's not just talking about open violence, which any fool can see is not particularly pleasant. He's talking about moral violence. Did not Christ say that the thought of the sin is the sin? Mystically speaking, if it's in here, it's already done. It's already a done deal. The karma is already in action. But dharma is your authentic lifestyle. And dharma can't be when you're a power-hungry person whose sole meaning in life is dominating others, nor can dharma occur when you're the slave or the servant of others. So man is quite capable of taking care of his domestic and social duties in a more mechanical, easygoing way, and reserving then time so that he can deal with the greater purpose of his life, his meaning of life, why he's actually on this planet. In the Indian Sanskrit, that was known as the Dharma, the way of Dharma. Heidegger, the German philosopher, referred to it as das Ein, the true being, the true self. Gerald Massey, the Egyptians had no vicarious atonement, no imputed righteousness, no second-hand salvation. No initiate in the Osirian mysteries could possibly have rested his hope of reaching heaven on the Galilean line of glory. His was the more crucial way of a menta, to tread with the guidance of the word, that step by step and act by act, he must himself make true. Now, a menta is the underworld. A menta is the shadow world. A menta is looking at the dark aspects of your own psyche. You're not going to get anywhere towards any kind of light until you first understand that where there's a strong light, there's also a lot of dirt that shines up. And until you take care of that dirt, there can be no question of higher forces or angels or gods coming to talk to you. If your soul, your psyche, your heart is poisoned with dark emotions and upsets and frustrations and what have you, you can rule out any idea of anything spiritual coming into your being or you as descending to anything. So the Egyptians understood that there's a cycle here that involves, yes, a cultivation of spiritual powers and awareness, but there's something else also, the release of the negative that is within us. And we are ourselves our own path makers of that. Eric Newman said in his book on the moon and matriarchal consciousness, the comparative passivity of matriarchal consciousness is not due to any incapacity for action, but rather to an awareness of subjection to a process in which it can do nothing, but can only let happen. It is an inner possession, realized and assimilated by the personality, but not easily discussed, for the inner experience behind it is scarcely capable of adequate verbal expression. For this reason, a plain and simple masculine consciousness finds the knowledge, quote unquote, of matriarchal consciousness unverifiable, willful, and par excellence mystical or mystic. That's right. We're back to the old idea of language being too limited. Language is very important for what it is to do, but there's another kind of communication. And therefore, there's a whole slew of different experiences that you'll have to go through mystically, which cannot be in any way reduced, not even the finest poets. Not even Ezra Pound or Rainer Maria Rilke or William Blake could put it into words. Leonard Shlain goes on to say, around 1500 BC, there were hundreds of goddess-based sects enveloping the Mediterranean basin. By the 5th century AD, they had almost been completely eradicated, by which time women were also prohibited from conducting a single major Western sacrament. Okay, so from being the keepers of the sacraments, the keepers of the mystery of being, to being a whole culture of matriarchs, we find a complete genocide taking place. A full answer to that is in my work on Atlantis. Right now, we can only focus on some of the permutations of it. Theodore Roszak in The Voice of the Earth says, In Maria's Gimbutas's influential formulation, it was the Indo-European incursion of warlike Indo-European nomadic tribes, worshippers of the masculine sky gods, that replaced the matricentric cultures of old Europe with the androcratic warrior society that henceforth claimed all virtues of civilization for itself. But before that, there had been a civilization of the goddess. We don't even notice the clothes that we wear, how they imprison us, or how our duties and roles imposed upon us by the ones around us are a form of imprisonment. We don't notice that the grids and the blocks and the squares on which we live are the most uneconomical form of city design imaginable, which is already a form of imposed imprisonment. And these are only the obvious ones I can think of off the top of my head right now. The influence of a book, says Kuhn, has done nothing to mitigate the virulence of the Western religion's bias against nature. Its glorification of the person and function in history of the Son of God has in effect diverted all interest in the religious field away from man's relation to nature. And we must understand that the expulsion from Eden, it really can be read this way. It can be read as the loss of the symbiotic connection with nature and the universal order, the scission between the microcosm and the macrocosm, between psychic energy and physical energy. As Kuhn said, thinking which does not start from and continue in close relation to its foundations in the physical universe must lead to falsity. And this could be then one of the new paradigms that we need to inherit in the new millennium. Perhaps man should be involved in this, that if he's right, if the disconnect from nature created this penchant for falsity, then what can we do about it? We can observe it. We can find out how. We can be constructive. We can find out how our thinking is perverse. Let's make that our study. Let's discover objectively, in a Gestalt way, how our very thinking is anti-natural. Instead of prolonging it and looking for the answer with that kind of framework, because of course, that's how can you solve the problem with the same level of intelligence that brought the problem about? You have to do something different. So in other words, you continue what you're doing, but you observe how your thinking is pathological or psychotic. You make that the new philosophy of life. Sounds crazy now, but it's a lot better than carrying on the way we're going. And again, not only the suppression and the distancing from nature, but the absolute marginalization and condemnation of the female particularly. In Genesis 3, God is speaking. We're told he's speaking to the serpent, but we understand that when you're talking to the serpent, you're also talking to the female. Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly thou wilt go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And now in the book Atlantis and in the DVD we've done on Atlantis, alien visitation, and genetic manipulation, we go into the crime against the female and showing that just in the later historical era, where under the guise of Judeo-Christianity, there's a rising, the Dominican order rising to persecute the witches. This is small potatoes. This is a very late in the day machination or attack on the feminine. The female, the hatred of the female and the war against the female goes back at least 13,000 years. And we talk about that in that other presentation. So what are the consequences of all this? Eric Fromm is happy to tell us. We have got ourselves into a state where our real difference from the animal is that we are the killer. Man differs from the animal by the fact that he is a killer. He, the only primate that kills and tortures members of his own species without any reason, either biological or economic, and who feels satisfaction in doing so. It is this biologically non-adaptive, non-phylogenetically programmed malignant aggression that constitutes the real problem and danger to man's existence as a species. He says the most ample and horrifying documentation for seemingly spontaneous forms of destructiveness are on the record of civilized history. The history of war is a report of ruthless and indiscriminate killing and torture, whose victims were men, women, and children. Many of these occurrences give the impression of orgies of destruction, in which neither conventional nor genuinely moral factors had any inhibitory effect. There is hardly a destructive act human imagination could think of that has not been acted out again and again. And of course, we all can point to that. We all know about that. We even know about that from our own lives. I certainly do, coming out of Northern Ireland. But you know that last line where he's talking about it all originating in the mind? That, to me, personally speaking, is a much more significant fact. I am more interested in the moral criminality, the moral and psychic violence that we perpetrate on each other every single moment of the day, as well as the ones that are more obvious in the world. This, to me, is important. I think it's also important for this new millennium that we start really being honest about this and looking into it, about the actual moral culpability before it becomes even physical. Because if we start dealing with that, perhaps we'll have a little bit less dying and murder in the world. George P. Marsh says that in his book, The Earth as Modified by Human Action, but man is everywhere a disturbing agent. Wherever he plants his foot, the harmonies of nature are turned to discords. Now, he said man there, but I always emphasize no. That's probably say masculine would be better, because women are capable of this kind of atrocity also. Erich Fromm says that in addition to sadism, the passion to destroy life and the attraction to all that is dead, that's necrophilia, seem to develop in new urban civilization. Michael Elner says, just look at us. Everything is backwards. Everything is upside down. Doctors destroy health. Lawyers destroy justice. Universities destroy knowledge. Governments destroy freedom. The major media destroy information. And religion destroys spirituality. And here we have Alvin Boyd Kuhn, the great scholar, underscoring what I just talked about this nature of our interior self. One of the most virulent aberrations resulting from the cult of anti-nature has been the exhibition of near masochism throughout the history of religion. The reference is to the cult of asceticism. With the full sweep into Western Christian consciousness of the doctrine of the sinfulness of the flesh, there came the preachment of the evils of the world, the flesh and the devil, giving rise to the pratique of self-mortification and brutal suppression of all natural impulses. The spirit was all, and the flesh was evil, and the deadly enemy of the immortal soul. This aberration he's talking about, and all the others I mentioned a few minutes ago, come under the heading of cruelty to the self. Not only are we meant to notice how our thinking and our mental patternings are based on a unsubstantiated and unsustainable psychotic paradigm, but we're also meant to also notice at the same time how we perpetrate cruelty to the self. It becomes very obvious, isn't it, when cruelty is perpetrated to another? I mean, that's pretty obvious, and we can see that, and we can reprimand that, and we can do something about it. But I believe that there are myriad ways in which the human being is equally, if not more, cruel to himself. But we are not too privy in the ways in which that is done. Again, the idea of every time you have to take orders from somebody you dislike, every time you can't live up to your own self-image, every time you poison yourself with things that you know is wrong for you, every time you blame yourself a million times over in your head, over and over and over and over and over again, for what? A small misdemeanor that you made a long time ago in history. You kill yourself 10,000 times when the deed only happened once. Cruelty to the self. If you're already in that kind of state, how can you be benevolent? I mean, truly benevolent. You may put on a mask and play the game, but how can you really honestly be of service or humanity or help to another person? So it's very important in our life to discover how we're cruel to our own selves. J.A.C. Brown, in his book Techniques of Persuasion, says, thus the tendency of religions to suppress the natural expressions of the sexual drive would seem to indicate a subconscious awareness of the fact that when normal outlets are allowed, sublimation into religious feeling is less likely to occur. One cannot help but notice the predominant role played by unmarried women in the Christian churches, or the visible loss of enthusiasm for religious interests on the part of happily married women. Many have noticed the common use in devotional works of sexual symbolism and the tendency to express religious feeling in erotic imagery, even to the extent of describing what, in another context, would be taken as an account of sexual orgasm. Of course, he's perfectly right. Many scholars have gone into this. Many of the feminists know this. Many of the yogic teachers understand this. Wilhelm Reich spent his whole life pointing this out. And we can't underestimate that. Of course, we are sexually repressed. We're cut off from our libido. We're completely at odds with the natural energies and flows of the body. But again, that itself is only one symptom of a greater malady, the one I've been talking about. That imposition happens from suppression, but it also happens from repression. Repression is when you are cruel to yourself. Suppression is when something else, mother or the father or the political state or the teachers or the apparatus, is forcing you to operate and confine yourself and sequester yourself and obey. We understand that one. That needs to be fixed. But again, the issue begins with our repression. How are we our own tyrant? How are we our own malefactor? Caitlin Matthews, the Celtic scholar, she writes, our exile has not only been from the goddess, but also from nature. It is not surprising considering that most Westerners live apart from their environment, protected by concrete roadways, consuming machine-processed foods and filled with media information to the detriment of the experience of our own senses. The seasons go unnoticed. We seldom touch the earth, eat fresh food, or observe the world personally. The sacred is a forgotten dimension in our society, which we ignore at our peril. David Watson, in his Pathology of Civilization, puts it very, very eloquently. He says, we reproduce catastrophe because we ourselves are traumatized, both as a species and individually, beginning at birth. Because we are wounded, we have put up psychic defenses against reality and have become so cut off from direct participation in the multidimensional wilderness in which we were embedded that all we can do is to navigate our way cautiously through a humanly designed day-to-day substitute world of symbols, a world of dollars, minutes, numbers, images, and words that are constantly being manipulated to wring the most possible profit from every conceivable circumstance. The body and spirit both rebel. That is the case in point. For those of you who are students of philosophy, you can get into Jean Baudrillard, the French scholar who talked about the simulacra, that we don't want the real, or we're not given the real anymore, we're given simulacras. And almost everything in this world, especially that in the commercial ambiance, is a simulacra for a real. And we become distorted. And if you live, he says, in a world filled with these plastic copies, these objects, it's only a matter of time before you start yourself acting and feeling and becoming like a plastic simulacra, an object, an unreal thing. We even hear today of real TV. It's a contradiction in terms. What you're watching on a screen isn't real. It's not happening when you're watching it. And you're watching a bunch of electronic, phenomena. It's not real. Real is what is outside your window, what's right in front of you on the table and in the chair in which you're sitting. This is not real. And yet we're told it's real TV. Carl Jung, the great German psychologist, said that in his book, Approaching the Unconscious, modern man does not understand how much his rationalism has put him at the mercy of the psychic underworld. He has freed himself from superstition, or so he believes, but in the process, he has lost his spiritual values to a positively dangerous degree. His moral and spiritual tradition has disintegrated, and he is now paying the price for his breakup in a worldwide disorientation and disassociation. We may wonder if the overwhelming success of linear perspective as the sole definition of visual reality isn't a symptom of some deeper condition seeking expression. And we might ask, why did some humans create and then rationalize with elaborate devices, ideologies, and defenses an unprecedented way of seeing the world based on distancing and detachment? Could it be that the linear perspective that infuses our vision from our glorification of intellectual distancing to our debunking of earlier realms of feeling and intuition, to our relentless lifting upward with skyscrapers and space shuttles, to the ultimate techno-utopian vision of a downloading human knowledge into self-perpetuating computers to make embodied life obsolete, that such a perception is the result of some traumatic violation that happened in our human past? Again, those familiar with my work on Atlantis know that that is in fact true. That 13,500 years ago and 50, and then before that, we had significant traumatic incidences that caused the predicament that we're in. And the modern historians and sociologists, because of the horrors of our modern world, are starting to put the pieces together and discover this. Chalice Glendenning says that Terry Kellogg emphasizes the fact that abusive behaviors, whether we direct them towards ourselves, other people, or other species, are not natural to human beings. People enact such behaviors because something unnatural has happened to them, and they have become deranged. Hey, but that's all right. We're the monopolies of the world. We got solutions. We're going to make billions and billions of dollars of all of that disenfranchisation and alienation and horror. We're not going to fix it. We're going to drug it. Talking of this bicamerality, which is the splitting of the hemispheres of consciousness, and that bicamerality is whether you want to phrase it as man from women, or masculine from feminine, or human from nature, or your mind from your own body. Eric Newman is speaking of it. He says, for a while the specific achievement of the male world lies in the development of masculine consciousness and the rational mind, the female psyche is in far greater degree dependent upon the productivity of the unconscious. So what Jung and Newman are saying here is that the feminine, another word for it, is basically the unconscious. And as scientists like Bruce Lipton have shown, the unconscious is 99 point something percent of our consciousness, our psyche. Ego, waking consciousness, is the smallest part. And eventually, we're going to have what Nietzsche referred to as the return of the repressed. We have the eternal return. We're going to have all of the content that we have been forgetting, and then forgetting we forgot about it. All those skeletons in the closet are going to be coming back, either projected onto other people, coming back that way, which we talked about in Weapons of Mass Deception, or in a more pernicious, homegrown way. But either way, it's coming back. The skeletons in the closet will come back. Bradley Pask, in his book Rape and Ritual, says the depreciation and loathing of woman, her body, and by extension the feminine, has been expressed repeatedly by our intellectual and psychological forefathers. St. Peter in the Gospel of Thomas is heard to say, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Tertullian, the patriarch, a church father, says, "Woman, you are the gateway of the devil. Because of you, the Son of God had to die." J.A.C. Brown, in Techniques of Persuasion, gives us a insight, an example into what happens when you suppress your libido in such a pernicious way. In the meeting, this Calvinist revival meeting, which followed in 1801, 20,000 men, women, and children assembled outdoors and listened to the doctrine of hellfire and eternal damnation for the unrepentant. Almost immediately, excitement broke out. Some ran about shrieking in agony, or rolled on the ground for hours at a time. Others rushed into the surrounding forest crying, "Lost, lost," at the full pitch of their voice. convulsive jerking movements began amongst many and spread like a contagion throughout the congregation and elsewhere. Groups of men and women went through the process known as treeing the devil, where they crawled around on all fours, barking and snarling at each other for long periods of time. Another phenomenon was the so-called frog hopping, when both men and women occupied themselves by frenziedly leapfrogging over each other. As might be expected, many in the final phases of the meeting went into trance or had visual hallucination and ended up by taking part in sexual excesses. And of course, we have the Roman Catholic Church well involved in those excesses in today's world. We know, as some people have said, that forgive me for echoing it, that the Roman Catholic Church is nothing but a hostel for pedophiles. Not originally, it wasn't like that, but look what it's become. He gives another example. He says, in 18th century France, in a convent, one nun began to mew like a cat until presently the whole community was mewing day after day, until stopped by the threats of the local militia, and the biting mania which spread through the convents of Germany, Holland, and Italy. In the latter case, powerful excitement manifested itself not only in biting, but in indecent exposure, tearing the hair out by the roots, and group howling and gnashing of teeth. And if you think these two examples are the only ones, think again. There are literally thousands of such examples. Martin Luther, in a statement in his own works, you can see the level of the psychosis. He says, when my heart is cold and I cannot pray as I should, I scourge myself with the thought of the impiety and ingratitude of my enemies, the Pope and his accomplices and vermin, so that my heart swells with righteousness and hatred, and I can say with warmth and vehemence, holy be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And the hotter I grow, the more ardent do my prayers become. That might sound outrageous to you living here in America. Coming from Belfast, it's completely understandable. When you see the atrocities in any of these countries, which is done under the name of religion, it quickly dawns on you that there's something seriously wrong. We have St. Augustine in the same predicament. He says, meanwhile, my sins were being multiplied, and my concubine being torn from my side as a hindrance to my marriage. My heart which clave unto her was torn and wounded and bleeding. To thee be praise, glory to thee, fountain of mercies. I was becoming more miserable, and thou nearer. John Edward. About here is the releasing of the repressed. We're going to have a time when the masks are coming down, and there's going to be a writing, there's going to be an adjudication. What Jordan, this is Jesus saying to his disciples, behold, when you enter into the city, there shall a man meet you bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he entereth in. This is coming in Luke when the disciples are saying, you're going to die, you're going to leave us. Where are we going to meet you? Where will we meet you, the Son of God? After you've left us. And he's saying, and he said to them, behold, you enter into the city. And in astrotheology, we heard that terms like city and city of David and Mount of Olives and tabernacle, these refer to the constellations into the zodiac. Go into the city. He's saying, look up to the city, and there shall a man meet you bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he entereth in. The sun will enter into the sign of Aquarius. The tarot cards themselves, if we understand what they are, the major arcana cards track this process of precession. Remember, as I said, the sun moves through all the houses of the zodiac. Well, just let's take even from Libra, going through Virgo to Leo to Cancer, to Gemini to Taurus to Aries and into Pisces. The cards of the major arcana are the little Polaroids for each of those ages. The individuals who designed and created the tarot have this remarkable job of taking one picture and encapsulating 2,160 years of events, experiences, and religious, and even the ideas. And they did it. It's successful. It works. Masudi, the 10th century Arabian historian and author, says, on the eastern or great pyramid built by the ancients, the celestial spheres were inscribed. Likewise, the position of the stars and their circles, together with the history and chronicles of past times, of that which is to come and of every future event. Also, one may find there the fixed stars and what comes about in their progression from one epoch to another. Perfectly stated. The ancients understood this. Not only could you understand what had come in the past, but the ancients knew what was to come, that there would be an age of iron and tears, where their bequeathments would be thrown to the winds. For instance, the age of Virgo, we said that the age of Virgo is very important in the chart of the Earth. It happens to be that in the age of Virgo, the pyramid was constructed. This is why in the present age of Pisces, which is its mirror opposite, antiquarian scholars and speculative laymen have been so interested in uncovering its secrets. And so it can be for the metaphysical practices also. So that's right. Here we are in the age of Virgo, the Pisces, but that faces the age of Virgo, many thousands of years ago, in which the pyramid and the Sphinx were built by the ancient Egyptians, our forefathers, who constructed these marvels in stone. And that's why the Piscean, Edgar Casey, predicted that it would be in the age of Pisces that we would rediscover or get reinterested in the mysteries of the ancient world, and particularly in Egypt. And we are. This very program and my work with Jordan Maxwell on astrotheology, again, trying to bring this gnosis out to the world, is very much evidence of what Edgar Casey and the prophets were talking about. Because there's nothing new under the sun. And we now need to look back there, not because we just have nothing better to do and we're fascinated by ancient history, but because we're fascinated by what's happening now. And we realize that our ancestors did things right the first time around because they had the greatest instructress of all, Mother Nature. We've got pornographic-minded politicians raping and mutilating their way through the world. It's your choice. We talked earlier about the return full circle, the 21st century. The return to what Egypt took as academic can be referred to as a return to the age of magic as opposed to the age of science. But I don't mean in some animistic, turn off, tune out way. When we see the word magic and we think of magic, what is it? How do we define it? We've been defining a lot of terms. Well, magic is loosely, it is anything which deeply and permanently affects us on all levels at once, physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. There's not too many things in the world that do that, but there are some. We all know in our own life what that might be. Additionally, it is also a process of unification. Magic is a process of unification, of synergy. It is also the understanding of the workings of holarchy. Yes, you're a magician. You understand the magic of life when you realize that this whole thing is a fractal, a hologram, a holarchy, and not a hierarchy with an upper and a downer, with an apart and a part. It is the understanding of how to live in accordance with the inviolable ordinances of nature despite your ego resistance. That's magic, an act of magic. Realizing that you want to live in harmony with something that's inviolable, but your ego resists it. Learning how to appease both, learning how to use this incredible office manager, as dictatorial and super disciplined and masculine and phallocratic as it is, it's also very needed. You don't club the ego and stun it with a kick in order to get rid of it, or drug it with pharmaceuticals and drugs and pharmaceuticals, or even drug it with ideologies. You win it over, and then you try to find a way to live in harmony with nature. That's the act of magic. It is learning to attain what is needed without violating the self, the other, or nature. And this means morally. As I said, yes, I'm concerned with the violence and the mayhem that's happening in the world, but I am much more, infinitely more concerned with the violence that goes on in your life every single day. Have you noticed how everything you do, or how many things you say, bring about hurt and horror to yourself, first of all, and then subsequently to others and to nature? How do we operate to get what we need? And I mean, get a full, rich life for ourselves without doing that. When we work on that particular thesis, we'll have plenty to be getting on with. And it is learning the difference, as we mentioned earlier, between being and doing. And magic is learning the difference between and the relationship between being and doing, like we saw earlier. These two things need to be fused. We cannot inculcate or awaken the feminine principle without understanding the message of doing, which perhaps the Eastern countries were more familiar with, but we certainly in the West need to re-examine this whole concept. And if you plant something that you want to happen, but you plant it in the wrong ground, if you plant the seeds of being in the ground of doing, and vice versa, life will not occur or happen the way you imagine it will. And in a very Socratic way, Aleister Crowley, speaking on this symbiosis and this connection, he says, we see then that we can never affect anything outside ourselves, save only as it is also within us. Whatever I do to another, I also do to myself. If I kill a man, I destroy my own life at the same time. Every vibration awakens all others of its particular pitch. Magic again, the idea that what you do literally does have ramifications. There's an ebb and a flow. There's a absolutely living and vital connection between you and the planet, you and other people, and it all emanates from your relationship with yourself. This is the lodestone, the key theme of the whole movement of magic. In science, you can get away with murder. You can do whatever you want because, of course, we are all working towards hypothetical futures. We believe in progress. We don't need to worry about the mess we're in internally. We just take all our sadism and all of our horror and we say, tomorrow we'll have all the answers. Now, this kind of thing that Crowley and the Gnostics have been talking about is really Christianity's core message. Peel away all of the miasma and junk, and you basically have at the core of Christianity the same message, because we are not here just to debunk, as we said. We're not here just to detract. There is purity within these religions. They can serve a purpose. Once the garbage is swept away and cleaned away, we can have something more pristine. If you have to leave it behind completely and move into another phase of thought and life because it's marred your consciousness so much, so be it. But others working within that system can do great good. This has been shown by Professor Tolkien, who in his book Lord of the Rings clearly depicts to us the journey into the underworld, and that there's a need to go into the dark and unholy places of the world in order to save humanity and find light and peace and harmony and freedom to yourself. And also C.S. Lewis from Belfast, the great Christian scholar. Within the framework, George MacDonald, there's many answers, George Russell, that we quoted from earlier, and many, many others. In Acts 7, we read, the Most High dwells not in temples made with hands. In 1 Corinthians, you are the temple of God, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. And in John 14, the works I do, you can do, and greater. So man is Adam Kadmon, Adam Ka-Amon, the sun god, the Anthropos. And if he's in perfect order inside himself, which is the act of magic, it's the act of discovering about who you are. And self-realization, say the Vedic people, is necessary before God realization. Know thyself was written at Delphi. And if you're in harmony, then we can have social harmony. So aware were the ancients that the human being was, in fact, the God incarnate, and that his body was the precise geometrical temple, that they even built their temples, like the famous Temple of Solomon, basing it on the inner architecture of the human mind. From Stedman's Medical Dictionary, we read that there's an outermost layer of the brain, the dura mater, the hard mother, is a tough covering that anchors the brain. And there's an outer holy place. That's the outer holy place. Then there's an innermost layer, the pia mater, the tender mother. That's a thin, delicate membrane. And then between these two, between the outer dura mater, the outer holy place, and the inner pia mater, lies a reticulated layer of tissue, the arachnoids, whose appearance reminds one of a spider's web. So we have the three chambers, the outer, the inner, and the middle veil, which is found in all sacred temples throughout the world. So there's a law of reciprocity operating in the universe. Aleister Crowley in Magic and Theory Practice says that anyone who is forced from his own course, either through not understanding himself or through external imposition, comes into conflict with the order of the universe and suffers accordingly. How appropriate, how correct, how perceptive. He's summing up the whole predicament. It doesn't matter whether it's suppression from outside or repression from within. You are alienating yourself from yourself. You are violating the inviolate laws of nature and suffering as a result. Aleister Crowley says in Heart of the Master, the true will must be consciously grasped by the mind. And this work is akin to that called the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. In Magic and Theory and Practice, he says, in the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel, the adept is possessed of all he can possibly need. To consult any other is to insult one's angel. We also said that magic was a process of unification. Now, the taroscopic approach, or system of divination, synthesizes the great hermetic arts of divination, as the first card of the tarot tells us to do. The high arts of tarot, astrology, Kabbalah, and numerology are the Western magical tradition, another means by which we initiate ourselves into our august and sovereign roles, as priests and priestesses, unto ourselves, answerable to no other authority. From the beginning of this program, we've been talking about the need to revisit the Egyptian lore precisely because they had a Western magical tradition. It's our magical tradition. And tarot, astrology, Kabbalah, and numerology. But these are all being taught as separate. They're all considered separate disciplines. They're not united anymore as they used to be in one collegiate, as one academic canon. My work with the taroscopic approach is a very important study of these subjects to find the glue that originally held them together. And once that is discovered, they can be used for the purpose that they were created, each one being more powerful now because they're linked with the others. Like the first card of the tarot tells us to do. You see the magician, the magi, the initiator, the enlightened one. He stands at a strange three-legged table, but on top of that table, he has united a wand, a cup, a sword, and a disc. And we understand that those are the suits of the tarot. We understand, if we do a little more research, that those suits do indeed stand for the four elements. The tarot researchers are familiar with that they represent fire, water, air, and earth. And if you do a little bit more homework, we conclude that these four elements relate, in fact, to the four types, the Jungian types of sensation, intuition, emotion, and intellect, or thinking. We understand that now. People have researched this. But in my work, I also like to show that these four implements also represent the four arts themselves that need to be unified. The Magus is number one. He's the first card. How can you unify consciousness when the tools that are meant to bring that about are not themselves in unison? First, we must unite the four disciplines, and then we have the pristine archive of knowledge. We've got the mystery school in which we can now enter in order to matriculate. But magic also involves the awakening of symbolic literacy, pattern recognition. The idea that we realize that there's other forms of communication and not just language in the world, not just words. And the words are very important, so are numbers, but so are colors and vibrations and rhythm and sound and the ways of nature. And how to decode that? We're referring to that as symbol literacy or pattern recognition. As Aleister Crowley said on the subject, it will soon be admitted on all hands that the study of the nature of things in themselves is a work for which the human reason is incompetent. Men will then be led to the development of a faculty superior to reason, whose apprehension is independent of the hieroglyphic representations of which reason so vainly makes use. So he's talking about, in his time and the future time to come, the holism of the brain, the revivification of the act of symbolic representation, but not just as any old artist does it, going into the depth of it, because in the book of symbolism there's a master chapter, and that master chapter is the chapter of the tarot. And speaking of magic, there are many levels of magic. There's the magic that happens all around us, and there's a magic that happens inside of us. Let us consider a few points. We say we remember a dream, but surely we were unconscious when we dreamt. So what part of us was watching the dream? Is dreaming a conscious activity after all? Are we the thinker or the thought, the dreamer or the dreamed? What we don't want to see about ourselves, we forget to think about, and then forget that we forgot about it. Is this what makes up our unconscious? All the things that we have forgotten about ourselves and dislike about ourselves? And if it came for a visit, if it returned, would we actually recognize it as ourselves? We question what consciousness is. It seems like a good activity. But who will answer such questions but consciousness? What we know about consciousness is what consciousness itself tells us. It believes itself to be whatever it wants to believe about itself. Will consciousness give us the truth about itself when it has a monopoly on it? And what if all its knowledge about itself is, in the end, really ignorance? We have convolutions. We have paradoxes in this world. From the side, a circle could appear like a straight line. From the top, a rod could appear to be a circle. How is the one contained in the zero? We know that from the zero, all numbers arise. Is one leaving or coming back to zero? Right? One comes out of zero, but 10 is one returning to zero. So what is it doing? Is it being born, or is it on its road to its death? Which one of two is the original one? A two is made up of two ones. Well, which one is the original? Or are both an original? You stand and gaze into a mirror. The mirror contains your form and its glass, and reflects back all there is to see, clearly, impartially, and without distortion. However, the mirror is also contained in you, is it not? It is taken in through your eye, and its image appears on your retina, within your brain. You are thinking the mirror that reflects your form. Are you the person in the mirror? Surely the reflection is not the you, but only your reflection. But if it is not real, then neither can you be. But if you are deemed real, then your insubstantial image must also be real. So which one is the reflection? Which one is real? Are both real? Or are both unreal? You are the mirror, and the mirror is you. One cannot be without the other. Both exist in a reciprocal relationship. So it is with man and his mirror, the universe. Now, it is not the mirror's fault if you do not like what you see in it. If you smash the mirror, is it not you yourself who gets broken? You cannot break the mirror without destroying yourself. You cannot destroy nature without destroying yourself. Perhaps man is about to discover that fact the hard way. Then we have from the Eastern world the concept of Maya, or ignorance, or illusion. This word came to mean the illusion of matter, of nature. It is thought to refer to the material world of karma and ignorance, which entraps the soul. In order to escape the trap of nature, aestheticism is required. However, the word Maya did not mean this. It originally actually refers to the illusionary or hallucinatory ideas that one has about matter or the world. That's right, the original world does not mean that there is an illusion, that nature and women and shadow and that which is lower is entrapping your soul. No, it meant the mental ideas you form about nature or about matter or about women or about God or about yourself. That is the illusion. It's all homegrown. Now, the magic of life is not in the operation of mind over matter, in fact, but the reverse. Mind is the child of nature, the maladjusted and autistic child. But mind is matter, is spirit, is body. The spirit is not trapped in matter because matter and spirit are the same thing. How can spirit be trapped by spirit? It is a plastic and finite mental template which the masculine modality of mind projects onto matter, which becomes the prison of being and which confounds consciousness, and not matter itself. Our recrimination against feminine nature is to be directed towards ourselves. Consciousness becomes antagonistic and sadistic in its erroneous but deeply imprinted belief that nature is its prison. Now, matter changes mind, which changes matter. A blank mind has a thought. That thought provokes action, which has consequences. These consequences, when experienced, change the actions and thinking of the future. We are dancers along the back of the Ouroboros serpent, eating its own tail. We change a glass of water by drinking that water. Yes, for sure. But that glass of water has also changed us forever. It is the science of this kind of observation, which is sensitively aware of how nature subtly and eloquently changes who we are on all levels. That is the source of the true magician's power. It is not the egoistic or egoic infatuation with how the limited and self-possessed mind changes nature. Crowley talked about the holy guardian angel. In the Bible, we talk about the Holy Spirit, the comforter, the watcher who looks over us. But we understand when we do our homework that that was Sophia, the principle of the feminine, which meant wisdom. Sophia is the dove that overlooks mankind, the paraclete, the comforter. The Holy Spirit was depicted in ancient times. The first images of God that are known come out of the Dravidian culture in India. And they're pictures of Lord Shiva, the Lord Pashupati, Lord of the beasts, Lord of the animals, with horns on his head, sitting in the yoga pose with his eyes closed in meditation, with the forest all about him. The earliest images of God that exist. Shiva, however, was known as the destroyer. Durga, Kali, also are connected with underworld and with severance and with cleansing and with cycles of destruction, or more correctly, deconstruction. And we hinted at that earlier, how important that would be. And we hinted also that Western man seems preoccupied by the idea of doing, number one, of blaming others for his mishaps, but also that spiritual development coming out of the religions of the world, coming out of Judeo-Christianity, we have this idea that getting to God is a very, very active and almost competitive and zealous thing. You get enlightenment, you own it, you attain it, you work for it. Well, the same way we work for a car, the same way we attain fame in the world. No, enlightenment is not such. It doesn't come into our grasp that way. Moreover, we have to understand that spiritual life has a catabolic function also. There's a reciprocal letting go, a reciprocal cleansing, just like there is with a garden. You don't just scream at the garden for the weeds to come out. You have to get down on your knees and do a lot of digging before you'll have the perfect garden. To empty a room full of trash and to get the air to be fresh, you have to open the window, but you can't scream for the wind to come in and clean the room. You've got to remove the garbage from inside the room, and then automatically the natural forces will take over. So it is for the psyche. But we have not learned how to clean our psyche. The shamans are all strangled and murdered and buried. Those who could have helped us heal are all been massacred in a campaign of genocide lasting centuries. So we don't know what the rites and rituals are. But we clean our beds, we clean our plates, we sweep the driveway. But we have lost the ability to clean our emotions and our psyche. So there's an anabolic and a catabolic dimension to spiritual growth. There's a rise and fall in life. There's an evolution and devolution. What the shamans from South America call the nagual and the tonal, or the yin and the yang. There's alchemy and there's physics. There's the masculine and the feminine. It doesn't matter what way you put it. Basically, there's a destructive and a constructive cycle. And in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, what you do not bring forth from within you will destroy you. Jesus said, whoever knows the all but fails to know himself lacks everything. And Carl Jung says, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside of you as fate. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus talks about the repressed content. He says, when you see your likeness, you rejoice. But when you see your image, which came into existence before you, which neither die nor which made manifest, how much will you bear? He's talking about the unconscious. Will you acknowledge that when suddenly it makes itself apparent with that other face that you've so carefully hidden behind the persona? Now, the dark aspects of our own psyche, which threaten the ego's autonomy and its vision of itself, are repressed. They're also subconsciously projected onto others, who become external representatives of our shadow self. This projection occurs as a compensation for the inner psychic tension we feel as a result of the repression. In severe cases, we also process this content through the field of other oblivious victims. Sometimes simple, constructive shadow work is also not enough. Other archetypes must come into play in order for the dark content to be exorcised. Now, Western man has made himself bereft of the rites and rituals, the rites of passage, the shamanic methods for dealing with the buildup of dark psychic content. We choose to ignore this and are patently psychologically arrested. Our avoidance condemns the earth and mankind. It engenders psychotic and sadistic leaders and many social deviances. We are going to find ourselves approaching a time of revealing, a time of apocalypse, a time when the masks will be coming down, to the amazement and shock of both protagonist and antagonist. The pure need to be ready for this and will need to understand what is happening. It is already happening. In the Manichaean Psalms of Thomas, we read, I will uproot the darkness and cast it out and plant the light in its place. I will uproot the evil and cast it out and plant the good in its place. The world shall be full of glory, the earth will be without suspicion, the whole world shall contain the righteous, they of the earth shall dwell in peace. There being no more rebel from henceforth, no name of sin shall be uttered again. The rich ones of light shall rejoice on every side without any grief. That which the living ones took was saved. They will return again to that which was their own. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said, he who blasphemes against the Father will be forgiven, and he who blasphemes against the Son will be forgiven. But he who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven, either on earth or in heaven. This incredible statement has been mulled over and analyzed by generations of scholars and researchers. It's very enigmatic. It not only exalts the Holy Spirit, but it says that, hey, if you sin against me, the Son of Man, it's forgiven unto you. And if you even sin, no matter how bad on God, it's forgiven unto you. But if you sin against this enigmatic and mysterious Holy Spirit, that the Bible doesn't even really go into explaining what it is, it can never be forgiven to you in this world or the next. The sin isn't even described, what kind of sin. It just says you sin against it. And it's a very, very serious infraction indeed. But what is the Holy Spirit? Well, we heard that it was Sophia. It's connected to Shiva. It might even be connected to Aleister Crowley's holy guardian angel, the watcher over us, the Egyptian Ka, from which we get the word the Christ. Well, here is wisdom. That third part of the Trinity, God, the Son of God, and the Holy Spirit. Here is wisdom. The Holy Spirit of the Trinity equals nothing more, nothing less than the self. That is the mystery. The self, that is you. In this tripartite breakdown, yes, what is the missing ingredient? We have God, we have Mary, we have Jesus, we have the world, but what's missing in this all-important religious Trinity is you, the self. The Holy Spirit, if you do your homework and decode it and find out and look into this matter, the Holy Spirit is nothing more than you. Call it the Christ, call it the holy guardian angel, call it the Ka, whatever term you want to use. And that is why if you sin against yourself, if you create violence to yourself, if you are cruel to yourself, you cannot be forgiven because it's unto you. It's all happening within your own republic. It doesn't matter what term we give it, what we call it, or even how we think of it. The self should be the most intimate thing for us. It was definitely that which we call the Holy Spirit until the Christians got hold of it, the Judeo-Christian paradigm. They wanted to separate, divide us, alienate us, and say, no, it's all over here. In divorcing ourselves from ourselves and making the self less important, unimportant. They caused the travesty. They give us this idea of a demonic presence waiting somewhere to judge us after life, and some fuming, wrathful God in the clouds watching our every move. But when it comes to the self, it really doesn't matter. You can steal it like they stole it. You can make a big mystery of it in order to control and suppress and dumb down. Or we can just decide, all of us, to just scrap it all and start again from the beginning. Perhaps that's the way. Perhaps that's the answer. What do you think?